The late afternoon sun dipped low, bathing the serene streets of New Oak Ridge in a rich, golden glow that seemed to wrap the neighborhood in a tender embrace. Children scampered across front yards, their gleeful shrieks and peals of laughter blending harmoniously with the soft whisper of leaves, swaying in the gentle breeze. Inside her snug living room, Lee Foster, a black woman approaching the twilight of her 30s, sat enveloped in a quiet thrill that pulsed through her veins. She rested a hand on her rounded belly, where the faint flutters of her first child stirred a deep, radiant joy within her. Today held a special promise. Esh had a doctor's appointment to check on her baby's progress, and the thought of hearing that tiny heartbeat again sent a shiver of eager anticipation down her spine. As she rose to gather her belongings, her phone buzzed sharply on the coffee table. A message from her brother, Nate, flashed across the screen. "Hey, sis. So excited to meet my little niece or nephew. Wishing you all the luck at the appointment." His words, brimming with warmth and encouragement, tugged a wide smile across her face. "Thanks, Nate," she typed back, her heart swelling with gratitude for his unwavering support. She slung her bag over her shoulder, grabbed her cherished water bottle, and stepped outside. Pausing to inhale the crisp, refreshing air, the sunlight kissed her skin, and she couldn't help but marvel at how the golden hues transformed the familiar houses and tree-lined streets into a scene of fleeting beauty. Lee eased into her car, adjusting the seat to cradle her growing belly comfortably. She flicked on her favorite playlist, a collection of mellow tunes that always soothed her soul, and set off toward the healthcare center. The streets hummed with the usual bustle cars weaving through traffic, pedestrians strolling along sidewalks, but a serene calm settled over her. She was cocooned in the joy of the life blossoming inside her, a quiet certainty that everything was aligning perfectly. That peace, however, shattered the moment she turned onto Elm Avenue. A sudden flash of red and blue lights erupted in her rearview mirror. Swirling like a swarm of furious wasps, her stomach plummeted, a cold dread seeping into her bones. "Oh no, not now," she whispered, her voice trembling as she stole a quick glance at the speedometer. She hadn't been speeding, she was sure of it. Yet the unpredictability of encounters like this gnawed at her. With clammy hands, she steered the car to the roadside, silencing the music as her pulse quickened. "Just stay calm," she coached herself, though her gut twisted with unease. "It's probably nothing." But as she watched a white police officer stride toward her window, that fragile hope began to fray. Officer Harper cut an imposing figure, a man in his 30s with a jaw set like stone and a commanding presence that radiated authority. His stern gaze locked onto Lee, and a wave of nausea churned in her chest. He moved with deliberate intent, his boots striking the pavement in a rhythm that echoed like a drumbeat of impending judgment. "License and registration," he barked, his voice slicing through the air without so much as a greeting. Lee swallowed hard, her throat parched and tight. "Yes, officer, just a moment," she stammered, her fingers fumbling through her bag as panic clawed at her composure. "I'm just heading to a doctor's appointment," she added, her tone soft and pleading, hoping to bridge the widening chasm of tension. Yeah, just hurry up," Harper snapped, his words sharp and jagged, impatience dripping from every syllable. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she finally retrieved the documents, her trembling hands betraying her nerves as she passed them over. "I'm sorry if I did something wrong," she said, striving to keep her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. Harper barely glanced at the papers before fixing her with a look of pure contempt. "You people always think you can do whatever you want," he sneered, his words lashing out like a whip. The accusation struck Lee like a physical blow, her breath catching in her chest. "What do you mean by you people?" she asked, her voice quivering with a mix of disbelief and rising indignation. Harper ignored her, his expression darkening. "Just get out of the car," he ordered, his tone brooking no argument. A frigid shiver raced down her spine, her mind reeling. "Please, I'm pregnant. I haven't done anything wrong. I just want to get to my appointment," she pleaded, desperation threading through her words as she clutched the edge of her seat. "Out. Now," Harper roared, his hand twitching toward his belt as if poised to escalate the encounter. Lay's pulse thundered in her ears. She'd seen too many news reports, heard too many stories of brutality, and the fear of becoming another name in that grim litany gripped her. "Please, I can't," she began, but his voice exploded over hers. "Get out of the car." His face contorted with rage, a mask of fury that left no room for reason. Swallowing her terror, Lee opened the door with agonizing slowness, stepping onto the asphalt where she felt stripped bare, vulnerable beneath his towering shadow. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice a fragile thread woven with confusion and dread. Harper loomed closer, his breath hot with disdain. "You think you can just ignore the law?" he spat, his eyes boring into her. "You think you're above everyone else?" "No, she started. But he silenced her with a rough shove, forcing her back against the car. The air rushed from her lungs in a gasp, her hands instinctively cradling her belly. "You're going to learn some respect today," he growled, his anger a living thing, wild and unchecked. "Please, I'm pregnant," she cried, tears stinging her eyes as panic and fury warred within her. "You can't do this." But Harper was a force unbound, his hands shoving her again, harder this time. Lee stumbled, her knees buckling as she hit the ground, pain radiating through her body like a shockwave. The metallic clang of her car door slamming shut reverberated through the street, drawing startled gazes from passers-by. A woman in a bright red coat froze mid-step, whispering to her friend, "What's happening?" Their wide eyes mirrored Lay's own fear, though they hesitated, uncertain whether to intervene. Tears streamed down Lay's cheeks as she lay sprawled on the pavement, her mind a chaotic whirl of terror and defiance. She'd done nothing to deserve this nothing, but exist in a skin that seemed to mark her as a target. "Why are you treating me like this?" she shouted, her voice raw and trembling, yet laced with a fire she couldn't suppress. "Shut up," Harper snarled, delivering another shove that sent her sprawling again. The growing crowd murmured, their voices a rising tide of unease. "This isn't right," a man in a faded jacket called out, his brow furrowed with concern. "Someone should help her." Harper whirled toward them, his hands slicing through the air. "Back off, this is none of your business," he bellowed, but the people edged closer, their whispers turning to shouts. "Leave her alone, she's pregnant," a woman with a stroller yelled, her voice thick with outrage as she gripped the handle tightly, her knuckles whitening. Lee lifted her gaze to the crowd, a fragile spark of hope flickering amid the ashes of her despair. Perhaps she wasn't as alone as she'd feared. The world around her blurred, the golden light dimming as her focus narrowed to the officer looming above her, a storm of prejudice and power. "You can't treat me like this," she cried, her voice ringing out with a strength that surprised even her. Harper faltered, caught off guard by her resolve, but his shock only fueled his fury. He stepped closer, his face a twisted mask of loathing. "You're just another black woman thinking she can get away with anything," he hissed, his words dripping with venom. The truth of his hatred sank into Lee like a stone. This wasn't about a traffic stop. It was about the weight of bias she carried every day, a burden she'd hoped her pregnancy might lighten, if only for a moment. Instead, it seemed to stoke his cruelty. The crowd's voices swelled, a chorus of defiance. "Let her go. She hasn't done anything," they roared, their unity a lifeline in the chaos. Harper's bravado wavered as he glared at them. "You're all just a bunch of troublemakers," he shouted, but his authority was slipping, eroded by the collective will pressing against him. Lee seized the moment, her resolve hardening. "You don't get to treat me like this because of my skin color," she declared, her voice soaring above the din, reverberating through the street. The crowd erupted in cheers, their support a balm to her battered spirit. "We're here for her. We will not be silenced," they chanted, emboldening her further. Harper's control unraveled, his eyes darting as the pressure mounted. For the first time, a flicker of doubt shadowed his face. Had misjudged the power of the people he sought to dominate. A piercing siren sliced through the tumult, the wail of an approaching police car shattering the standoff. Harper's head snapped toward the sound, his confidence faltering as the flashing lights drew nearer. Reinforcements were coming, but they might not be his salvation. The consequences of his unchecked power loomed large, a reckoning he couldn't escape. As the second vehicle screeched to a halt, Lee drew a shuddering breath, the strength of the crowd surging behind her like a tidal wave. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. This was a stand for every soul. who'd face the sting of injustice, every heart bruised by the abuse of authority. The lesson was clear. Power wielded without mercy could ignite a fire of resistance, and justice, though battered, could rise from the ashes of oppression. The air was thick with tension as a young officer leapt from the patrol car, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Harper, stand down. What in God's name is happening here?" he bellowed, his tone a mix of disbelief and command. Harper froze, his broad shoulders slumping as the weight of his choices crashed over him like a tidal wave. His chest tightened, a bitter cocktail of shame and defiance swirling within him. He'd gone too far this time, crossed a line he'd always told himself he'd never even approach, and now the consequences were bearing down, relentless and unforgiving. His eyes darted to the ground, unable to meet the piercing gaze of the rookie who'd just called him out. Lee stood trembling a few feet away, her breath shallow and rapid, her heart hammering against her ribcage as if it might break free. She clutched her purse tightly, her knuckles whitening under the strain, and forced her voice to steady as she addressed the new officer. "Please, sir, I am just trying to get to my doctor's appointment. I swear I didn't do anything wrong." Her words tumbled out in a rush, laced with desperation and a flicker of hope. She could feel the sweat beating on her forehead, the adrenaline surging through her veins like wildfire. The new officer turned to her, his face hardening with resolve as he nodded. "Let her go, Harper. You're the one out of line here," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. The crowd around them and lookers, who'd gathered on the cracked sidewalk of this small-town street, burst into a roar of approval, their cheers rising like a chorus of triumph. For Lee, the sound was a lifeline, a fragile thread of hope weaving through the fear that had gripped her moments before. She'd stood up to the injustice threatening to swallow her whole, and maybe, just maybe, someone would finally listen. Harper took a reluctant step back, his fists clenching at his sides as a storm of anger and frustration brewed in his gut. His jaw tightened, teeth grinding together as he fought the urge to lash out. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, not in front of a crowd. The sting of humiliation burned hot in his chest, but beneath it lurked something darker, the gnawing realization that he'd abused the power he'd sworn to wield justly. Lee, meanwhile, drew a deep, shuddering breath, the cool morning air filling her lungs as she steadied herself. She'd fought back against the towering figure of authority that had loomed over her, and though fear still lingered like a shadow, she refused to let it silence her again. The road ahead stretched out uncertainly, a winding path fraught with battles yet to come. Discrimination wasn't a beast easily slain, and she knew this was only the beginning. But in that fleeting moment, with the sun breaking through the clouds and the crowd's voices echoing in her ears, she felt a spark of empowerment ignite within her, a fire ready to face whatever lay ahead. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows over the sleepy town, Lee lay unconscious in a sterile hospital room, the steady beep of machines her only companion. Her family huddled together in a cramped waiting area down the hall, their hands clasped tightly as if they could will strength into one another through touch alone. The air hung heavy with unspoken fears, each tick of the clock reverberating in their minds like a drumbeat of dread. Nate, her older brother, sat with his elbows on his knees, his fingers raking through his dark hair as worry carved deep lines into his face. He glanced at Liam, Lay's fiancé, whose usually steady hands now trembled as he gripped a styrofoam coffee cup. "I can't wrap my head around this," Nate muttered, his voice rough with emotion. "She was just driving to the doctor." "How does that turn into this?" Liam's eyes, red-rimmed and glassy, met his. "I know," he replied, his voice cracking like thin ice. "That Officer Harper had no right. We can't let this slide. People need to know what he did." Beyond the waiting room, the hospital corridor buzzed with restless energy. Friends and neighbors trickled in, their faces a mosaic of concern, anger, and quiet resolve. Word of the shooting had spread through the town like a spark through dry grass, igniting outrage that drew people together in a shared demand for justice. Among them was Mrs. Carter, a weary woman in her 60s who'd known Lee since she was a child. She stood near the vending machines, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, whispering fiercely to a young man beside her. "That girl's got a heart of gold, and they treat her like this. It's a disgrace," she said. her voice trembling with indignation. The young man nodded, his jaw set as he murmured, "We're not letting this go. Not this time." Their words mingled with the low hum of others, a growing chorus of defiance that pulsed through the halls. A nurse stepped into the waiting room, her crisp white uniform a stark contrast to the muted chaos around her. Her expression was grave, her lips pressed into a thin line as she cleared her throat. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I need to speak with Lay's family." Every head snapped toward her, the air growing impossibly thicker. Nate's heart lurched into his throat. "Is she okay?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The nurse hesitated, then took a steadying breath. "She's stable for now, but it's too early to say if there'll be lasting damage. She's still unconscious, but you can see her for a few minutes." Relief flooded Nate's chest, a fleeting warmth quickly chased by a cold wave of dread. "Thank you," he managed, his voice hoarse as he rose to his feet. The nurse led them down a fluorescent-lit hallway, each step echoing with the weight of their fears. As they neared Lay's room, Nate's pulse thundered in his ears. What if she never woke up? What if she couldn't hear them? Liam, sensing his spiraling thoughts, placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "She's a fighter, Nate. We'll be here for her. She'll know we're not giving up." Inside the room, Lee lay motionless, a fragile figure dwarfed by the tangle of wires and machines surrounding her. Bruises bloomed across her pale skin, stark against the white sheets, and an oxygen mask obscured half her face. The sight hit Nate like a punch to the gut, his knees nearly buckling as he approached her bedside. He reached for her hand, her fingers cool and limp in his grasp. "Lee, it's Menet," he whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of love and desperation. "We're here." Liam stood at the foot of the bed, tears spilling silently down his cheeks as he stared at the woman he'd promised to build a life with. "Please wake up, Lee," he choked out. "We need you." Nate squeezed her hand tighter, as if he could pour his strength into her through that single point of contact. "We love you. You're going to be okay, just keep fighting." The door swung open abruptly, shattering the fragile stillness. A reporter burst in, his notebook clutched like a weapon, his voice brash and insistent. "Excuse me, can I get a few questions about the incident?" Liam whirled on him, his grief igniting into fury. "Not now," he roared, his voice raw with pain. "My fiancée is fighting for her life in here, and you want to talk. Get out," the reporter faltered, his bravado crumbling under Liam's glare. "I'm sorry, didn't mean to," he stammered, retreating with a hasty nod. As the door clicked shut, Nate sank into a chair beside Lay's bed, his gaze drifting to the hallway beyond. "What happens now?" he murmured, dread creeping back into his bones. "We can't just sit here. That officer Harper needs to pay." Liam's eyes hardened, his voice steady with resolve. "I'll make sure of it. He doesn't get to walk away from this." Hours stretched into an eternity, the family's vigil unbroken until a doctor entered, his presence commanding their attention. "Doctor." Sullivan's face was etched with fatigue, but his tone was measured as he spoke. "I wanted to update you on Lay's condition. She's stable, but we're keeping a close eye on her. The next 48 hours are critical." Nate's breath hitched. "Will she wake up?" he asked, his voice a fragile thread. The doctor's expression softened. "It's impossible to predict right now. We'll keep you posted. Talk to Harriet, might help her hear you." After he left, Nate and Liam took turns at her side, their voices weaving a tapestry of memories and promises. They spoke of the baby she carried, the future they'd dreamed of, the love that bound them together. Outside, the town stirred with unrest, protests swelling in the streets as the community rallied around Lay's cause. Signs demanding justice for Lee and end police brutality dotted the plaza, the air crackling with collective fury. Days later, Nate and Liam joined the march, their exhaustion eclipsed by a burning need to act. Holding a sign aloft, Nate felt a surge of purpose. He wasn't just a brother anymore. He was a voice in a movement. That evening, back at the hospital, he leaned close to Lee. "We're fighting for you out there," he said, hope flickering in his chest. Then, a miracle, her fingers twitched. "Lee, can you hear us?" he gasped. Slowly, her eyes fluttered open, confusion clouding her gaze. "Nate," she rasped, her voice a faint echo. Tears streamed down his face as he clutched her hand. "Yes, I'm here." "You're safe." Relief and fear warred within her as she pieced together the nightmare she'd endured. But one truth stood firm. Justice wasn't just a hope, it was a lesson carved into their lives. A warning of the ruin that follows when power turns tyrant. The distant hum of chants and the swell of voices crying out for justice drifted through the hospital window, wrapping Leela in a strange sense of comfort. She wasn't alone in this nightmare, far from it. A young nurse, her eyes bright with a mix of awe and tenderness, leaned closer as she adjusted the fur drip. "You're an inspiration," she said, her voice trembling with genuine admiration. "You've got so many people out there rooting for you, holding you up." Leela turned her head slightly, her throat tight with emotion. "I never wanted any of this," she replied, her words quivering like leaves in a storm. "But I'll be damned if I let them bury what happened to me." Each syllable carried the weight of her resolve, a spark reigniting deep within her battered body. As the days passed and her strength trickled back, a plan began to take shape in her mind. Sharp and unyielding, she looked at Nate, her brother, and Liam, her fiancé, their faces etched with exhaustion and unwavering loyalty. "I need to speak," she declared, her voice steadier now. "I want the world to hear me." Nate's lips curved into a proud, bittersweet smile. "We've got your back, Leela. Your story, it's bigger than just you now." "It matters," Liam nodded, his hand squeezing hers gently. "We'll make sure it echoes." Weeks unfolded slowly, each one painting Leela's recovery as a vivid testament to resilience. Beyond the sterile hospital walls, the community refused to let her fade into silence. They gathered in the streets, their voices rising like a tide. Not just for her, but for every soul crushed under the heavy boot of police brutality. With every sunrise, Leela felt the fire in her chest grow hotter, her determination hardening into something unbreakable. She wouldn't let her pain dissolve into the background, another forgotten headline. She was ready to rise, to demand justice not just for herself but for all who'd been wronged. As the day of her first public appearance loomed closer, she stood before a cracked hospital mirror. Drawing in a deep, shaky breath, this was their moment to lay bare her truth. She wasn't just a survivor, she was a warrior, and retreat wasn't in her blood. The rally arrived with a crisp March breeze, and Leela's stomach churned with a cocktail of excitement and dread. Stepping toward the microphone, she felt the ground tremble beneath her feet as the crowd exploded into cheers, a roaring wave of support crashing over her. Her family flanked her, Nate's steady presence, Liam's quiet strength, and their love was a lifeline. She exhaled, letting the warmth of the crowd fill her lungs, and prepared to fight. One voice, she thought, could ripple into a revolution. The news of Leela's shooting had erupted like a thunderclap, tearing through the community with relentless fury. People stumbled through their days, reeling from shock, their anger simmering just beneath the surface, laced with a bitter confusion. How could a police officer gun down a pregnant woman for nothing more than driving her car? The image haunted every television screen. Leela, pale and motionless, strapped to a stretcher as paramedics rushed her away in a blur of flashing lights. At the hospital, friends and family poured into the waiting room, their faces carved with worry. Leela lay unconscious in her bed, a fragile figure tethered to machines that beeped in a steady, mournful rhythm. Her family encircled her, gripping her limp hands, their whispered prayers rising like smoke. Nate couldn't stay still, his lanky frame paced the linoleum floor, his sneakers squeaking with every frantic step. "Why her?" he muttered, his voice raw and jagged. "She was just heading to her appointment. Just driving." Liam sat nearby, his broad shoulders slumped, his face drained of color. "We've got to hold it together for her," he said, his tone soft but firm, though his eyes betrayed his terror. "She needs us to be strong when she opens her eyes." Nate jerked his head in a nod, swallowing hard to choke back the sob clawing at his throat. "I can't wrap my head around it," he said, his fists balling up. "That cop should be in chains." As they spoke, a doctor approached, his white coat stark against the muted tones of the waiting room. His expression was grave, his steps deliberate. "Can we talk privately?" he asked, motioning toward a small side room. Nate's heart slammed against his ribs as he and Liam followed, the air thick with dread. "Is she okay?" Nate blurted, his voice dripping with panic. The doctor sighed, his shoulders sagging under an invisible weight. "Leela's stable for now, but her injuries are severe. We're doing all we can, but it's touch and go." Liam's breath hitched, a lump lodging in his throat. "And the baby," he whispered, barely able to form the words. "The baby's holding on," the doctor replied, his tone measured. "But we need to keep a close watch on both of them. Stress could change everything, and I can't promise a happy ending." Tears prickled Nate's eyes. Hot and relentless. "No, she's a fighter," he insisted, his voice cracking. "She has to make it through this." The doctor offered a nod, but his guarded look spoke volumes. Shope was a fragile thread, and they were all dangling from it. Back in the waiting area, Nate's grief twisted into rage. "We can't just sit here," he growled, his fists tightening until his knuckles whitened. Liam frowned, leaning forward. "What are you saying?" Nate's eyes blazed. "We've got to tell the world what happened. We can't let her story die." Liam's jaw tightened, a spark of agreement flaring in his chest. "You're right. That bastard officer Harper shot her for nothing. We can't let him walk free." Their shared fury forged a purpose, and they dove into action. Ideas tumbled out fast, organizing a rally, a beacon to unite the community and scream for justice. They wanted to shine a spotlight on the rot festering in the police force, the systemic failures that had stolen Leela's peace. The next day, as reporters swarmed the hospital like vultures, Nate and Liam retreated home, their minds buzzing. They hunched over a rickety kitchen table, printing flyers on a wheezing old printer, the ink smudging their fingers. "Join us for a rally to support Leela and demand justice," the bold text declared. They set up social media pages, their phones lighting up with notifications as friends pledged to spread the word. The days ticked by, and Nate's nerves danced a jagged edge between hope and fear. They were challenging a Goliath, a system armored in power, but silence wasn't an option. When the rally dawned, the air crackled with tension, thick and electric. Town square swelled with body snipers, strangers, all clutching signs that screamed justice for Leela and end police brutality. Banners fluttered in the wind, bold and defiant. Nate and Liam stood at the front, the crowd's energy pulsing through them like a heartbeat. They'd poured their souls into this, and now it was real. "Thank you all for being here." Nate's voice boomed through the microphone, raw and resolute. "We're here to honor Leela and demand justice. No one should be shot for driving their damn car." The crowd roared, a tidal wave of sound. Their chants justice for Leela, rising into the sky as they thrust their signs higher. The rally stretched on, and one by one, voices emerged from the throng. A middle-aged woman, her face lined with years of quiet struggle, stepped forward. "I stand here because I believe in change," she said, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "We've got to hold power accountable." Each story tales of profiling, of violence spilled onto the fire, stoking a fierce unity. Nate caught Liam's eye, a swell of pride passing between them. This wasn't just a gathering, it was a reckoning, a mark seared into their town's soul. As dusk crept in, the crowd lit candles, their tiny flames flickering against the darkening sky. A tribute to Leela. "Together, we'll make a difference," Liam shouted, his voice thick with emotion. "Leela's story matters, and we'll make damn sure it's heard." Applause thundered back, a vow etched in sound. Nate felt a rush of something bright hope, maybe as they stood shoulder to shoulder, ready to claw their way toward change. Later, as they drove home through the quiet streets, the rally's echo lingered. "We did it, man," Nate said, his voice bubbling with exhilaration. "We got their attention." Liam smiled, but a shadow flickered across his face. "Yeah, but what's next? We can't stop now." Nate nodded, his jaw set. "This is just the start. We'll keep fighting for Leela, for everyone who's been broken by this." The horizon swallowed the sun, but the community stood tall, united in their quest for justice. Back at the hospital, Leela's body mended inch by inch, her spirit a quiet storm gathering strength. Outside, the streets buzzed with purpose, people marching, shouting, demanding Officer Harper face the music. Their fury was a living thing, fueled by the betrayal of trust, the abuse of power that had nearly snuffed her out. Nate felt it too, a restless burn urging him forward. He knew Leela would want this justice not just as punishment, but as a lesson carved deep. Those who wield power must answer for its weight. The fight was far from over, and they were just beginning to find their footing in the storm. Under the golden light of a late afternoon sun, Nate sat hunched over a weathered wooden table in his cramped living room, surrounded by a small circle of friends and family. The air felt thick with grief, frustration, and a simmering resolve that pulsed through every word they exchanged. His hands trembled slightly as he clutched a chipped coffee mug, the warmth doing little to soothe the cold knot of anger in his chest. Lay's facer bright smile, her fierce spirit flashed in his mind, now marred by the brutal reality of her lying motionless in a hospital bed, fighting to survive after a police officer's reckless violence. He couldn't sit still any longer, couldn't let the silence swallow their pain. "Guys," he said, his voice rough but steady, cutting through the murmur of the room. "We need to organize a rally. We can't just wait for justice to fall into our laps. We've got to demand it loud and clear." Liam, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, nodded sharply. His dark eyes burned with a mix of fury and unshakable determination, reflecting the same fire that had ignited in Nate. "You're damn right," he replied, stepping closer to the table, his boots scuffing the worn floorboards. "This isn't just about Lee anymore. It's about every single person who's been kicked down, judged, or hurt just for existing in their own skin. We've got to show the police, the city, hell, the whole world, that we're done taking this quietly." The room buzzed with agreement, heads nodding, voices overlapping in a chorus of resolve. They weren't just friends gathered in sorrow, they were a fledgling army, united by a shared wound and a hunger for change. The planning unfolded like a storm gathering strength. Nate's living room transformed into a war room. The table soon buried under a chaos of scribbled notes, colorful flyers, and laptops glowing with social media pages. They typed furious messages, their fingers flying across keyboards, reaching out to local activists, churches, and anyone who'd listen. Every call they made, every post they shared, felt like a brick laid in the foundation of something monumental. They wanted the rally to be massive, an undeniable roar that would echo through the city streets, proving how many hearts beat for Lee and for justice. Outside, the neighborhood hummed with its usual rhythm, kids laughing, cars rumbling bibit inside. The air crackled with purpose. Nate felt it deep in his bones, a flicker of hope warring with the crushing weight of responsibility. Lee had always been the unbreakable one, the spark that lit up any room. Now, with her voice silenced by a hospital ventilator, it was his turn to carry her torch, and the burden felt heavier than he'd ever imagined. As the rally day dawned, the sky stretched wide and blue, the sun casting sharp shadows across the town square. Nate stood at the edge of the growing crowd, his breath catching as he watched people stream in, friends with clenched fists, strangers with tear-streaked faces, all clutching signs scrawled with bold demands: justice for Lee, stop police brutality. The square pulsed with life, a sea of bodies swaying together, their energy electric and raw. Nate's heart swelled with pride, but a thread of anxiety twisted through it. Could he lead them? Could he give voice to their collective rage and pain? He scanned the faces around him, seeing not just numbers but stories. A young mother clutching her son's hand, an elderly man with a cane and a steely gaze, all bound by a shared refusal to let Lay's suffering fade into silence. When the moment came, Nate climbed onto a rickety wooden platform, his palms sweaty as he gripped the megaphone. The crowd hushed, hundreds of eyes locking onto him, expectant and fierce. "Thank you all for being here," he shouted, his voice cracking at first but growing stronger with every word. "We're here to honor Lee, to fight for her, and to demand justice, and not just for her, but for every soul who's been a victim of police violence." The square erupted, cheers crashing over him like a wave, the chant of justice for Lee rising in a rhythmic pulse that thudded in his chest. He raised his hands, signaling for quiet, his throat tight with emotion. "Lay's in that hospital right now, battling to stay with us. She didn't deserve this. No one deserves to be beaten down because of their skin. We're here to say enough is enough." The crowd roared back, their voices a wildfire of agreement, spreading heat through the chilly morning air. Speaker after speaker took the stage, each story peeling back another layer of the community's pain. Tasha Morgan, a weary young woman with a voice like steel, stepped up, her hands trembling, but her gaze unflinching. "I'm here because I'm exhausted," she said, her words slicing through the noise. Exhausted from living in fear of the police, From watching my friends get hurt or worse just for being black, I've seen too many tears, too many broken lives, and I'm done hiding from it. We've got to fight back, together." Her voice didn't waver, but her eyes glistened with unshed tears, and Nate felt his own sting in response. Tasha wasn't just a name in the crowd, she was a mirror, reflecting the quiet terror and fierce defiance that so many carried. The cheers that followed her words shook the ground, a testament to the power of her truth. As the rally stretched on, the square brimmed with life, swelling with latecomers who squeezed in shoulder to shoulder, their fists raised high. The chants grew louder, the slogan sharper, a vow carved into the air: they wouldn't stop until the world listened. Nate stood at the edge of the stage, soaking it in, his spirit lifted by the sheer force of their unity. But then, a ripple moved through the crowd, heads turning as a familiar figure emerged. Diane Foster, Lay's mother, walked slowly toward the front, a bouquet of wilted daisies clutched in her hands. Her face was a map of grief-deep lines etched by sleepless nights, eyes red-rimmed but burning with pride. Nate's heart lurched as he rushed to her, wrapping her in a tight embrace. "I'm so glad you're here," he murmured, his voice thick as he felt her tremble against him. "I couldn't stay away," she whispered back, her grip on the flowers tightening until her knuckles whitened. "Lee needs to know we're all with her." Together they stepped to the front, Diane's presence a quiet thunder that hushed the crowd. Nate took a shaky breath, turning to face them. "Everyone, this is Lay's mom," he called out, his voice breaking with reverence. "She's the strongest person I've ever known, and she's here with us today." Applause rolled through the square, a wave of love and respect for the woman who'd borne so much. Diane looked at Nate, her lips curving into a faint, weary smile. "Lay's going to pull through," she said, her voice soft but firm, a lifeline of hope in the chaos. "She's a fighter, always has been." Nate nodded, tears prickling his eyes as he squeezed her hand. They were in this together, a family forged not just by blood but by purpose. The rally burned on, each speaker fanning the flames of outrage and resolve. As the sun dipped low, painting the square in hues of amber and gold, Nate felt a fragile hope take root. Yet, as the crowd began to thin, a shadow of doubt crept in. What came next? Would Officer Harper, the man whose abuse of power had shattered Lay's life, ever face the consequences? The questions gnawed at him, heavy and unanswered, but he pushed them aside. "Remember this day," he called out as the rally drew to a close, his voice raw but resolute. "We're not just here for Lee, we're here for everyone who's been silenced, everyone who's been crushed under the weight of injustice. We'll keep fighting until justice isn't just a word, but a reality." The crowd's final cheer was a battle cry, a promise sealed in sweat and tears. Days later, the hospital's sterile halls pressed in around Nate and Liam as they sat by Lay's bedside. The beep of machines filled the silence, a cruel reminder of her fragile state. News of her shooting had spread like a spark through dry grass, igniting fury across the city. Nate scrolled through his phone one afternoon, his thumb pausing on a video of a downtown people marching, shouting Lay's name, demanding accountability for Harper. His pulse quickened, a jolt of adrenaline cutting through his exhaustion. "Liam," he said, turning to his friend, who sat hunched over, staring at Lay's still form. "We can't just wait here. We've got to join them, keep her story alive." Liam's head snapped up, his jaw tightening. "You're right. Lee wouldn't want us sitting here, helpless. Let's go." With renewed fire, they rallied their circle again, spreading the word to join the protests. The hospital staff moved around them in a blur. Nurses murmuring updates. Lee was stable, but critical, teetering on a knife's edge. Each time a doctor approached, Nate's stomach twisted, bracing for the worst. "She's holding on," one said, his tone clipped but kind. "But it's still touch and go." The words landed like stones, sinking Nate deeper into the fight. Justice wasn't just a rally cry, it was a lesson carved in blood and tears, a warning of what happened when power went unchecked. Together, they'd make sure Lay's story didn't end in silence, that her pain became the spark for a reckoning long overdue. The hospital room was steeped in a heavy silence, broken only by the rhythmic beep of machines that monitored Lay's fragile state. Her injuries were grave, a brutal testament to the violence she'd endured. And though she showed faint signs of responding to treatment, The doctor's words carried a somber weight. "She's making progress," he said, his voice soft yet measured. "But we can't promise she'll fully recover. It's a long road ahead." His tone was gentle, almost apologetic, as if he wished he could offer more than cautious hope. Liam stood by her bedside, his fists tightening until his knuckles whitened, a storm of rage and helplessness swirling within him. "She's a fighter," he declared, his voice trembling with conviction. "She'll pull through, this has to. She's stronger than anyone I know." The doctor gave a small, appreciative nod, his eyes reflecting a flicker of admiration for their unwavering optimism. "I hope you're right," he replied, "but we need to stay grounded. Right now, our focus should be on giving her the best care possible and supporting her every step of the way." With that, he stepped out, leaving a lingering air of uncertainty behind him. Nate and Liam lingered in the room, their gazes locking in a shared moment of resolve. Beneath their determination burned a deep, gnawing despair. They knew Lee couldn't speak for herself. Not yet. Her story, her pain, her fight, it was up to them to ensure it wasn't buried in silence. They felt the weight of that responsibility pressing down on them, a quiet vow forming between them. They would be her voice. That night, the sterile waiting room became their war room. The dim fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as they sat on stiff chairs, surrounded by the faint hum of distant footsteps and the occasional murmur of hospital staff. Nate's brow furrowed in thought before his face lit up with an idea. "What if we start a social media campaign?" he suggested, his voice brimming with sudden energy. "We could tell Lay's story, every detail of what happened, the shooting, the injustice of it all. People need to know." Liam's eyes sparked with excitement, a rare break in the storm cloud of his anger. "That's brilliant," he said, leaning forward. "We'll flood the internet with hashtags, photos, everything. We'll make sure no one can ignore what happened to her." For hours, they poured their hearts into the task. Fingers flew across phone screens as they drafted posts, each word carefully chosen to capture the raw truth of Lay's ordeal. They uploaded pictures of her smiling in happier times, her vibrant spirit shining through, and paired them with stark accounts of the protest, where she'd been shot. They wove in pleas for action, urging others to join their cause, and reached out to local activists whose voices could amplify their cry. The waiting room, once a place of quiet dread, transformed into a hive of purpose. As their campaign took root, a shift rippled through the hospital. The air in Lay's room seemed lighter, infused with a fragile hope as messages of support began trickling in. Friends shared their posts, family rallied behind them, and soon, strangers from across the city joined the chorus. The hashtag Justice for Leah gained momentum, threading through their community like a lifeline, connecting voices from every corner, young and old, rich and poor, all united in outrage and solidarity. The days ticked by, each one building toward the protest they'd planned. Nate and Liam could feel the tension mounting, a heady mix of anticipation and unease swirling in their chests. This wasn't just a mark, it was a tribute to Lee, a demand for accountability, a stand against the abuse of power that had nearly stolen her life. On the morning of the event, the sun broke over the horizon in a blaze of gold, casting long shadows across the city square where the crowd was already gathering. Nate's heart thudded against his ribs as he and Liam arrived, their breath catching at the sight before them. The space was alive, with people, hundreds of them, clutching handmade signs that screamed for justice, their voices rising in a chant that pulsed through the air. Justice for Lee. The energy was electric, a current of defiance and unity crackling through the throng. Liam clutched his own sign, the ink still fresh, and felt a swell of pride as he joined the fray, shoulder to shoulder with strangers who'd become allies. The march began, a river of humanity flowing through the streets. Families walked alongside students, their children hoisting signs they'd colored themselves. Elderly residents leaned on canes, their weathered faces set with determination. Teenagers shouted slogans, their voices raw with passion. It was a tapestry of life, woven together by a shared hunger for change. Stories spilled from the crowd, whispered tales of discrimination, of brushes with unchecked authority, each one a thread in the larger fabric of their cause. At the front, a local activist named Maria seized the moment. Her voice boomed over the makeshift megaphone, fierce and unyielding. "This can't be another tragedy we let fade away," she cried. "Lee deserves justice, and not just words, but action. We'll fight until those in power answer for what they've done." The crowd roared back, a wave of cheers crashing through the air, their resolve hardening with every echo. Nate felt a lump rise in his throat, tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. This wasn't just about Lee anymore, it was about every soul who'd suffered under the same heavy hand. Every life diminished by a system that too often shielded the powerful. As they pressed forward, Nate's phone buzzed relentlessly in his pocket, notifications pouring in like a digital tide. Their campaign had leapt beyond the city's borders. People in distant towns were sharing Lee's story, posting their own messages of outrage and support, sparking calls for action in their own streets. The march reached its crescendo outside the local government building, a gray monolith that loomed over the square. Speakers took turns at the podium, their words weaving a tapestry of hope and defiance. When Nate's moment came, he stepped forward, his palms slick with sweat, his pulse hammering in his ears. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice shaking before it steadied. "We're fighting for Lee, but this is bigger than her. It's for everyone who's been hurt, silenced, or crushed by police brutality. We won't stop, not until justice is real, not until it's served." The crowd erupted, a thunderous blend of applause and chants. Justice for Lee, justice for all, their voices rising like a hymn of purpose. The protest stretched into the afternoon, a living, breathing testament to their unity. People lingered, swapping stories over coffee passed around in paper cups, forming connections that would fuel their fight in the days to come. They weren't just a crowd anymore, they were a movement, a force that refused to be ignored. In the wake of the rally, the nation took notice. News vans rolled into town, cameras flashing as reporters interviewed marchers. Their stories splashed across screens and headlines. The pressure bore down on local officials, whispers of police reform growing louder in council chambers. Back at the hospital, Lee's condition began to steady, her vitals strengthening with each passing day. Nate and Liam never left her side for long, bringing tales of the protest to her bedside, showing her the flood of support that had risen in her name. They wanted her to feel the fire of the community burning for her, to know she wasn't alone. One quiet afternoon, the room hushed as Lee stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, then opened, her gaze cloudy with confusion. "What happened?" she whispered, her voice a fragile thread. Nate leaned closer, his heart leaping. "You're in the hospital, Lee. You were shot, but you're safe now. You're going to heal." He paused, tears glistening in his eyes. "The whole community's fighting for you. We held approach. People are demanding justice." Her brow creased, processing his words. "Fighting for me," Liam nodded, his own tears spilling over. "Yeah, Lee, you've got an army out there. They're not letting this go." A spark flared in her eyes, faint but fierce. "He can't get away with this," she said, her voice growing steadier, fueled by a deep well of resolve. "We need to make him pay." Nate squeezed her hand, his grip firm with promise. "We will, Lee. We're not stopping it ever. We'll keep this going until justice is yours." Outside, the sun climbed higher, bathing the city in light. A crowd had gathered once more beyond the hospital walls, their signs aloft. "Justice for Lee. Stop police violence," their faces etched with hope and grit. Inside, Lee lay surrounded by the steady hum of machines, the pain in her chest a constant reminder of the night that had changed everything. She remembered flash-esque chaos of the protest, the crack of gunfire, the searing agony as she fell. Now, as she looked at Nate beside her, his hand clasped around hers, she felt a quiet strength blooming within her. "I was so scared," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I thought I'd lost you." She managed a faint smile, her gratitude anchoring her. "I'm still here," she murmured, "and I'm not giving up." Beyond the hospital doors, the movement swelled. Activists like Maria organized press conferences, their words sharp and unapologetic as they recounted tales of systemic abuse. Friends and family stood shoulder to shoulder with strangers, their collective energy a living pulse of defiance. The lesson was clear. Justice wasn't a gift bestowed from above, it was a right to be claimed, a battle to be waged, and the consequences of power unchecked were laid bare in Lee's wounds. In the trembling voices of the crowd, in the unshakable will of a community that refused to bow. The road ahead stretched long and uncertain, but with every step, every chant, every shared story, they forged a path toward accountability and a future where no one else would have to endure what Lee had. The air outside thrummed with the roar of 1,000 voices, a swelling tide of defiance that crashed through the streets and spilled into the hospital room where Leah lay. She pressed her cheek against the cool glass of the window, her breath fogging faintly as she listened to the chants rising from the crowd below. "Justice for Leah," they shouted, their voices weaving into a fierce, unbroken harmony that seemed to shake the very walls around her. Her chest tightened not with pain this time, but with a raw, electric surge of strength. "They're out there for me," she thought, her heart pounding with a mix of gratitude and resolve. "I can't let them falter. I won't." The cries of her supporters wrapped around her like armor, stoking a fire deep within her soul that refused to dim. Down in the streets, the days stretched into a relentless rhythm of protest and vigil, each gathering swelling larger than the last. The community had transformed their grief into a blazing call for change, their footsteps pounding the pavement as they marched beneath banners and flickering candlelight. Liam stood at the forefront, his broad shoulders squared against the wind, clutching a sign that screamed in bold, black letters, "Justice for Leah." His hands trembled slightly not from fear, but from the ache that gnawed at him every time he pictured her lying in that sterile hospital bed, tubes snaking across her skin. She was his world, and the thought of her voice being silenced by injustice twisted his insides into knots. Beside him, Nate's jaw was set, his eyes blazing with a quiet fury as he scanned the sea of faces. Together, they were an unyielding force, determined to carve out a reckoning for the woman they both adored. "Leah's a warrior," Liam's voice boomed over the crowd one evening, cutting through the dusk like a blade. He stood on a makeshift platform, the megaphone trembling in his grip as he poured every ounce of his devotion into his words. "She fought for her life against all odds, and now it's our turn to fight for her. We won't stop not until justice crashes down on those who tried to break her." The crowd erupted, their cheers a thunderous wave that rolled through the streets, their energy leaping from one person to the next like wildfire. Up in her room, Leah watched, her breath catching as tears traced hot paths down her cheeks. Pride swelled within her, mingling with the ache of her wounds, and she felt their love cocooning her, a warmth that seeped into her bones and set her spirit ablaze. As the protests raged on, Nate and Liam huddled one night beneath the dim glow of a street lamp, their faces etched with exhaustion and resolve. The air was thick with the scent of sweat and asphalt, the distant hum of the crowd a constant heartbeat beneath their words. "We can't just shout into the void," Nate said, his voice low but steady, his fingers tapping restlessly against his knee. "We need to take this to City Hall. Force them to listen." Liam nodded, his eyes glinting with a steely determination that mirrored the stars above. "They need to see we're not backing down, not now, not ever." The decision settled between them like a pact, and the next morning, they strode toward the towering stone facade of City Hall, their steps echoing with purpose. They weren't alone. A throng of supporters had already gathered, their signs bobbing like buoys in a restless sea, their voices rising in a crescendo that rattled the building's windows. The atmosphere crackled with tension and hope, a storm of emotion brewing as Nate climbed onto a bench, his silhouette sharp against the gray sky. "We're here for Leah," he bellowed, his voice carrying over the clamor. "For her, and for every soul crushed under the weight of discrimination. We demand justice now." The crowd roared back, their shouts bouncing off the stone walls and flooding the halls within. Inside, the officials sat stiffly, their polished shoes tapping nervously beneath mahogany desks as the weight of the people's fury pressed against them. Liam stepped forward, his voice cutting through the room like a whip. "This isn't just about Leah. It's about all of you as our whole community. We won't let another person suffer like she did. Not on our watch." Weeks bled into one another, and Leah's body slowly knit itself back together. Each day, she felt the strength seeping back into her limbs, a quiet triumph over the bullet that had tried to claim her. From her window, she watched the protests swell, the flickering lights of candles and the bold sweep of banners painting the city in hues of resistance. One afternoon, a news van rolled up, its crew spilling out with cameras and microphones, their lenses glinting in the sunlight. Leia's heart raced as she smoothed her braided hair and straightened her shoulders. With Nate and Liam flanking her like sentinels, she faced the reporter, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "I want the world to know what happened," she said, her words ringing with clarity. "I was driving to an appointment, nothing more. Then Officer Harper shot me, for no reason at all. I didn't deserve this, no one does." The reporter's eyes softened, but her pen scratched furiously against her notepad. "What do you want to see happen next?" she asked. Leia's gaze hardened, her resolve a steel thread woven through every syllable. "I want accountability. Officer Harper needs to face the consequences of what he did. We can't let this keep happening. We need change, real change." When the interview aired, her words rippled across the nation, igniting conversations in living rooms and boardrooms alike. Her courage became a beacon, her story a rallying cry that drew even larger crowds to the streets. She wasn't just Leia anymore. She was a symbol, a living testament to the fight against the brutality that had scarred so many. At the hospital, her family hovered close, their presence a steady anchor amid the storm. Nate sat by her bedside one evening, his broad hands clasped tightly as he looked at her with eyes full of pride. "You're a fighter, Leia, a true one," he said, his voice thick with emotion. She smiled, the warmth of his words wrapping around her like a hug. "I couldn't stop now if I tried," she replied, her tone fierce yet soft. "Not with all of you behind me, outside." The pressure on the officials mounted until it finally cracked. Officer Harper was suspended, an investigation looming over him like a shadow. The community exploded in cheers, their voices a triumphant symphony. But Leia knew this was only a step, not the finish line. This is just the start, she thought, her spirit blazing brighter than ever. The fight stretched on, spilling into town hall meetings where the air buzzed with raw emotion. Residents packed the rooms, their stories pouring out like river tales of fear, of loss, of defiance. Leia attended every one she could, her wheelchair rolling across creaky floors as she listened to voices that echoed her own pain. There was Maria, a mother whose son had been roughed up by police for riding his bike too late, and James, a shopkeeper whose store had been trashed during a wrongful raid. Together, they wove a tapestry of ideas, better training, community oversight, a system that didn't devour its own. Leia's voice rose above the din at one meeting, steady and unshakable. "We're stronger united," she told the crowd, her words slicing through the noise. "This isn't just my fight, it's ours, for a future where no one's afraid to walk their own streets." As the sun dipped below the skyline, painting the city in shades of gold and violet, Leia sat by her window, gazing out at the vibrant pulse of the community she'd always called home. The investigation into Officer Harper trudged forward, a slow grind toward justice. But she and her supporters stood firm, their resolve a mountain against the wind. She thought of the lessons etched into every moment of this struggle, how power, when twisted, could shatter lives, but how justice, when pursued with unrelenting heart, could mend them. With Nate, Liam, and a sea of voices at her side, she felt invincible. The road ahead stretched long and treacherous, but Leia was ready. For herself, for her people, for a world Rimadesh would fight on, unyielding, until the end. A radiant grin spread across Nate's face as he gazed at Lee, his eyes gleaming with admiration. "You're looking so strong, Lee. We're beyond proud of you, honestly. It's incredible how the whole community has come together to lift you up." His voice carried a warmth that wrapped around her like a comforting embrace. Baya, standing nearby, felt a tidal wave of emotions crash over her, pride swelling in her chest, gratitude pulsing through her veins. The unwavering support from friends, neighbors, and even strangers had been nothing short of a lifeline, pulling her through the darkest moments. "I can hardly wrap my head around how many people genuinely care," she said, her voice steadying as it grew with conviction. "It's overwhelming in the best way. It fuels me, makes me want to push forward even harder." At that moment, the door swung open with a gentle creak, and a nurse stepped into the room, her presence a burst of brightness against the sterile white walls. She clutched a clipboard to her chest, her cheerful demeanor lighting up the space as she chirped, "Hey there, Aya. How are we feeling today?" Leia's lips curved into a soft, hopeful smile. Feeling good, really good. I'm ready to get out of here, to go home. Her words hung in the air, laced with a quiet determination that hadn't been there weeks before. The nurse nodded enthusiastically, her ponytail bobbing with the motion. That's fantastic to hear. Just a few more tests to run, and we'll see if we can make that happen for you. Nate and Liam, perched on the edge of their seats, exchanged quick, excited glances. They could feel Lay's longing to reclaim her life radiating off her in waves, especially now. With a baby on the way, a tiny spark of hope nestled within her. As the nurse busied herself checking Lay's vitals, her fingers deftly moving over the equipment, the trio's conversation shifted to the rally they'd been meticulously planning. "We're getting everything set for Saturday," Liam said, his voice brimming with purpose. "We want the whole world to hear your story. Leto, understand what you've been through." Aya's eyes, sharp and resolute, met his. "I need my voice to carry," she declared, her tone fierce yet steady. "This isn't just about me, it's about every single person who's faced this kind of brutality. We have to shake things up, demand change." The nurse, finishing her checks, flashed an approving smile. "I love your fire, Lee. You're going to light a spark in so many people." With a final scribble on her clipboard, she slipped out, leaving a quiet buzz of anticipation in her wake. Lee turned to Nate and Liam, her expression hardening with a seriousness that seemed to anchor the room. "We can't let Officer Harper just walk away from this," she said, her voice low but unshakable. "He has to answer for what he did. There have to be consequences." Nate's jaw tightened as he nodded. "We're going to make damn sure everyone knows the truth about him. This is only the starting line." As they dove into their plans, Lay's heart surged with a fragile but growing hope. She could already see it unfolding in her mind's eye. A sea of faces at the rally, fists raised, voices united, signs swaying in the breeze, all calling for justice and an end to the discrimination that had scarred her life. Days later, the community's fervor hadn't dimmed, it had exploded. News vans lined the streets, cameras flashing as reporters scrambled to capture every angle of Lay's story. Social media hummed with activity, the hashtag #JusticeForLeah climbing to the top of trending lists. People from neighboring towns, strangers who'd only just heard her name, poured in their support, drawn to her fight like moths to a flame. By the time Saturday dawned, the sun blazed overhead, casting golden light across the town square. The air crackled with energy as families, friends, and unfamiliar faces converged. A vibrant tapestry of humanity bound by a shared cause. Hand-painted signs bobbed above the crowd, bold letters screaming "Stop Police Violence" and "Lee deserves justice," their colors vivid against the clear blue sky. Nate, Liam, and Lee arrived together, a tight-knit trio amid the chaos. Lee, seated in her wheelchair, radiated a quiet strength that belied her fragile frame. As she waved to the crowd, a ripple of smiles and cheers erupted, the sound swelling until it filled the square with an electric hum. Nate stepped up to the microphone, his broad shoulders squared, his voice booming with raw emotion. "Thank you all for being here today. We're standing together for Lee, for justice, for what's right." The crowd roared back, their applause a thunderous wave, their chants of "justice for Lee" reverberating off the surrounding buildings. Baya, watching from the sidelines, felt her breath catch. The sheer number of faces, sighing and old, tear-streaked and defiant at her like a punch. She was overwhelmed, not just by gratitude, but by the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. When it was her turn, Lee gripped the microphone with trembling hands, her heart pounding so fiercely she thought it might burst. But as she spoke, her voice steadied, rising above the murmurs of the crowd. "I'm so grateful for every one of you standing here with me. I didn't just survive an act of violence. I'm here to fight for everyone who's been broken by injustice. This isn't just my story, it's ours." The crowd erupted, their cheers a tidal wave of solidarity, their voices climbing higher as they shouted her name. Speaker after speaker followed, each one peeling back layers of their own pain, stories of discrimination, of brushes with police brutality that left scars both visible and unseen. Aya listened, her chest tightening with every word, pride and sorrow tangling together. She felt a kinship with these strangers, their shared struggles forging an unspoken bond. One speaker, a weary man with gray-streaked hair and a voice like gravel, seized the microphone with a fire that silenced the square. "This is what we need: unity. We have to demand accountability, not just whisper about it. Fear can't gag us anymore." His words struck Lee like a lightning bolt, igniting her resolve. She knew they were carving a path forward, one that couldn't be undone. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the square in hues of orange and pink, Lee took the stage once more. "We won't be silenced," she proclaimed, her voice cutting through the evening air. "We'll keep fighting until every single person in this community feels safe. Respectable justice isn't just a word, but a reality." The crowd's response was deafening. A unified cry of "justice for Lee, justice for all," that seemed to shake the earth itself. Exhausted but exhilarated, Lee and her family returned home that night, the echoes of the rally still ringing in their ears. They collapsed onto the couch, a tangle of weary limbs and hopeful hearts, knowing they'd struck a chord that day. But beneath the triumph lingered a sobering truth. The battle was far from won. Officer Harper still loomed like a shadow, his actions unpunished, his power unchecked. As they sipped tea and let the day's adrenaline fade, they brainstormed late into the night. Nate, ever the strategist, suggested partnering with local groups pushing for police reform. His brow furrowed as he jotted down names. Liam, pacing the room with restless energy, floated the idea of a petition to rally even more voices. Lay's eyes sparkled with a fierce determination. "We need to reach everyone we can," she said, leaning forward. "Let's show them we're not backing down, not until there's real justice." Weeks rolled by, and the pressure on the police department grew unbearable. Protests flared up like wildfires, each one louder than the last. The community's resolve hardening with every step. News anchors dissected the story on evening broadcasts, their voices grave as they spotlighted the epidemic of police violence. Lay's health slowly returned, her body mending as her spirit soared. She felt the weight of her role in it just as a survivor, but as a beacon for those too afraid to speak. Then, one quiet afternoon, as she rested on the couch with a blanket draped over her swollen belly, Nate's phone buzzed with urgency. "You need to get to the station," the voice on the other end crackled. "They're making an announcement about Harper." A jolt of electricity shot through her. This was the moment they'd been clawing toward. She and Liam scrambled to get ready, anticipation thrumming in their veins as they sped to the police station. A crowd had already swelled outside, a restless knot of reporters, cameras, and supporters. Lay's heart raced as she joined them, the air thick with tension. When the police chief stepped to the podium, his face a mask of forced calm, the chatter died instantly. "We're here to address the shooting of Lee Foster," he began. His voice clipped. "After a thorough investigation, Officer Harper has been suspended without pay. Pending further review." Gasps rippled through the crowd, and Lay's stomach twisted, relief warring with a simmering rage. "Is that it?" she hissed to Liam, her fists clenching. "Where's the real accountability?" The chief pressed on undeterred. "We'll also be implementing new training programs to ensure our officers act with sensitivity and respect." The crowd exploded, shouts of fury drowning out his words. "That's not enough," someone bellowed. "He needs to pay." Lee pushed forward, her voice rising above the chaos. "This isn't about training, it's about justice. Officer Harper shot me for no reason, and he needs to face the consequences." The crowd surged behind her, their chants of justice for Lee, a battle cry that rattled the station's walls. She felt the fire blazing within her, fueled by the bitter lesson of Harper's unchecked power, a stark reminder that justice wasn't guaranteed, but fought for. This was their moment, and they wouldn't let it slip away. The air buzzed with restless energy as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the sea of faces gathered in the town square. Lee stood at the heart of it all, her chest tight with a storm of emotions, anger, fear, but above all, an unshakable resolve. She could feel the weight of every gaze fixed on her, the crowd's collective hope and fury pulsing like a living thing. "I will not stop until we see justice served," she proclaimed, her voice cutting through the evening chill with a clarity that surprised even her. It was a promise, not just to them but to herself, a vow carved from the pain of everything she'd endured. The crowd erupted, their applause crashing over her like a wave, each cheer a brick added to the fortress of her determination. She wasn't alone in this fight, not anymore, and that truth steadied her trembling hands. As she gripped the edges of her jacket, anchoring herself against the rising tide of emotion. Beside her, Nate squeezed her hand, his calloused fingers warm and firm against her cold skin. His eyes shone with quiet pride, a flicker of a smile tugging at his lips. "You've got this," he murmured, his voice low but steady, a lifeline in the chaos. He'd been there through every sleepless night, every moment she doubted herself. His unwavering faith a mirror reflecting the strength she hadn't known she possessed. Nearby, Liam shifted on his feet, his broad shoulders tense, but his face alight with awe. He'd always been the dreamer of their trio, the one who saw possibilities where others saw walls. And now he looked at Lee as if she'd just turned one of those dreams into reality. "I can't believe we're actually doing this," he said, shaking his head, his voice thick with disbelief and something like wonder. "We're making a difference." Lee met his gaze, her lips curving into a faint smile despite the knot in her stomach. "We are," she replied, "and it's because of everyone who's stood with us." The press conference had drawn a restless throng, reporters jostling for position, their cameras flashing like lightning in a storm, and townsfolk packed shoulder to shoulder, their murmurs a low hum beneath the tension. This wasn't just another news story. It was a reckoning. The mayor stepped up to the podium, his gray suit crisp against the fading light, the sun glinting off the microphone as he cleared his throat. Silence fell, heavy and expectant. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his tone measured but carrying the weight of authority. "We're gathered to address the tragic shooting of Leila Foster, a pregnant mother, gunned down by Officer Harper while driving home from a routine day. This tragedy has torn at the very soul of our community." His words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable, and Lee felt her breath catch. She glanced toward the crowd and caught sight of her mother, standing near the front, her weathered face streaked with tears, not of sorrow this time, but of fierce, unshakable pride. Their eyes locked, and in that moment, Lee felt a surge of courage, a fire kindled by the woman who'd taught her to stand tall no matter the odds. The mayor pressed on, his voice rising. "We want to assure you that justice will be served." The crowd roared in response, a tidal wave of sound that shook the ground beneath Lay's feet. "Justice for Leila," they chanted, their voices weaving into a fierce, unyielding chorus that echoed off the brick buildings lining the square. Lay's heart raced, her pulse pounding in her ears as she soaked in their passion. This was why she'd fought to heal, why she'd clawed her way back from the edge, because this moment, this unity, was the spark of something bigger. As the mayor stepped aside, yielding the podium, Lee knew her time had come. She moved forward, her legs trembling beneath her, the microphone cold and slick in her grip. "Thank you for being here," she said, her voice breaking slightly before she steadied it, letting it ring out clear and strong. "I'm here to tell my story, not just for me, but for everyone who's faced discrimination and violence because of the color of their skin." The crowd stilled, their attention a tangible force pressing against her. She could feel the weight of their expectations, their anger, their hope, and it fueled her. "I was driving to my doctor's appointment," she continued, her words sharp with the sting of memory. "Just a regular day, thinking about my baby when Officer Harper pulled me over. He didn't see a mother, a person saw a threat. He treated me like I was less than human, and without cause, he shot me." Gasps rippled through the audience, a collective intake of breath that mirrored the shock she'd felt in that moment, the searing pain, the blood, the terror of losing everything. She could still hear the crack of the gunshot in her nightmares, feel the way the world had tilted as she slumped against the steering wheel. "I want everyone to know I didn't deserve that," she said, her voice rising, fierce and raw. "No one deserves that." She paused, letting the truth settle, watching as fury flickered across the faces before herald men with clenched fists, young women with tears in their eyes, children clinging to their parents' hands, all united by her words. "This isn't just about me." She pressed on, her heart hammering against her ribs. "It's about every mother who's lost a child, every father who's buried a son, every brother and sister torn apart by police brutality. We have to stand together to make sure this never happens again." The applause that followed was deafening, a thunderclap of solidarity that rolled through the square and into the deepening dusk. Tears pricked at Lay's eyes, hot and insistent, but she blinked them back, drawing strength from the sea of voices echoing her own. "I'm fighting for my baby," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "And I'm fighting for all of us. We need to hold those in power accountable. Officer Harper needs to face the consequences of what he did." As she stepped back, Nate was there in an instant, pulling her into a tight embrace. "You did it, sis," he said, his voice rough with emotion, his arms a shield against the world. "I'm so damn proud of you." The crowd's cheers swelled again, their chants a heartbeat thrumming through the night, and Lee let herself lean into her brother's strength, just for a moment. The mayor returned to the podium, his expression grim but resolute. "We will investigate this incident thoroughly," he declared. "Officer Harper will face criminal charges, and will work to overhaul the policies governing police conduct in this community. This is only the beginning of our fight for justice." Lee glanced at Liam, who stood a few steps away, his dark eyes gleaming with admiration. He shook his head again, a grin breaking through his usual quiet demeanor. "This is unreal," he said, his voice barely audible over the crowd. "We're actually doing it." The evening wound down, and as people began to drift away, Lee, Nate, and Liam lingered, their spirits buoyed by a fragile but growing hope. The road ahead stretched long and uncertain, shadowed by the weight of what they'd taken on. But they were ready. In the days that followed, the community rallied around them with a fervor that took Lay's breath away. Neighbors she'd barely known knocked on her door with casseroles and kind words, their eyes bright with determination. Fundraisers sprang up like wildflowers, bake sales in the park, car washes in the grocery store Lotal to help with her mounting medical bills. Each event a testament to the town's refusal to let her fight alone. The local community center buzzed with activity, hosting packed forums where people shared their own stories of injustice, their voices weaving a tapestry of pain and resilience that mirrored her own. One quiet evening, as Lee sat on her faded couch, the phone rang, jolting her from her thoughts. "We'd like to do a follow-up interview." The voice on the other end said, a reporter from the local news station, her tone warm but insistent. "Your story has inspired so many, and we want to share it with a wider audience." Lay's stomach fluttered, a mix of excitement and nerves twisting inside her. "I'd love to," she replied, her heart racing. "But I want to keep the focus on change and accountability." The reporter chuckled softly. "That's exactly what we're after. Your bravery sparked something big, and we want to amplify it." Hanging up, Lee leaned back, her mind drifting to the shooting, blinding flash of the gun, the endless hospital nights, the faces of her family and friends who'd carried her through. Each memory was a stone in the foundation of her resolve, a reminder of why she couldn't stop now. The day of the interview arrived, and Lee sat beneath the studio lights, her palms damp against her jeans. The reporter smiled, her eyes kind but piercing. "Thank you for joining us, Lee. Can you tell us about your journey since the incident?" Lee took a deep breath, steadying herself against the rush of memory. "It's been a long, hard road," she began, her voice firm despite the tremor in her chest. "When I was shot, I was terrified I'd lose my baby, terrified I'd never recover. I felt so helpless lying there in that hospital bed. But my family, my community gave me strength. They showed me I wasn't alone, and that's when I knew I had to speak up, not just for myself, but for everyone who's faced this kind of injustice." The reporter nodded, her expression rapt, and Lee felt the words pour out, raw and unfiltered. "What message do you have for others going through something similar?" the reporter asked. Lay's gaze sharpened, her voice steady with conviction. "You're not alone," she said, her eyes burning with purpose. "We have to lift each other up, stand together against this. Change starts with us telling our stories, demanding accountability from those who abuse their power. Justice isn't just a word, it's a fight, and we can't stop until we win it." As the interview wrapped, a wave of relief washed over her, mingling with pride. She'd come so far, and though the battle wasn't over, she could feel the tide shifting. Weeks stretched into months, and the investigation into Officer Harper ground on, a slow, grueling process that tested their patience. But the community didn't waver. Protests flared outside the police station, their signs bold and defiant, their voices a relentless drumbeat of demand. Vigils lit up the park at night, candles flickering like stars against the dark, each flame a prayer for justice. Nate and Liam threw themselves into every event, their presence a steady anchor for Lee. Nate, with his quiet intensity, organized logistics with a precision that belied his easygoing nature, while Liam, ever the optimist, rallied the crowd with speeches that lit fires in their hearts. One crisp afternoon, as they gathered for yet another rally, Lee climbed the makeshift stage, the wind tugging at her coat. "We're here to demand accountability," she shouted, her voice soaring over the sea of upturned faces. Officer Harper thought he could act without consequence, but we're here to show Hyman to everyone like him that power isn't a free pass. Justice means facing the cost of your actions, and we won't rest until that happens. The crowd roared, their energy a living pulse that wrapped around her, lifting her higher. She thought of her baby, of the future she was fighting for, and of every soul lost to the same brutality. This wasn't just her story, it was theirs, a collective cry against a system that too often shielded the guilty. Justice wasn't abstract, it was personal, a debt owed to every victim of unchecked power. And as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of fire and shadow, Lee knew they'd keep pushing to get until that debt was paid. The air trembled with the weight of defiance as the gunshot echoed through the streets, a vicious punctuation to Officer Harper's attempt to silence the growing unrest. Blood seeped through the fabric of Lay's shirt, staining her pregnant belly, yet her spirit remained unbroken. She staggered, but stood firm, her dark eyes blazing with a fire that refused to be extinguished. Around her, the crowd surged forward, their voices rising in a thunderous chorus that drowned out the fading reverberation of the shot. "Justice for Lee, justice for all," they chanted, their words crashing against the brick walls lining the narrow streets of their small town. The unity was electric, a palpable force that pulsed through every clenched fist and tear-streaked face. Lay's chest heaved as she absorbed the swell of support, a tidal wave of empowerment washing over her. She wasn't alone in this fight, not anymore. The community's unwavering resolve wrapped around her like armor, and in that moment, she felt a flicker of hope ignite deep within her soul. They weren't just fighting for her. They were battling for a future where no one would have to endure the sting of injustice. She had faced. Days turned into weeks, each one heavy with anticipation as the rally's momentum grew. The streets buzzed with whispered conversations and bold declarations, the air thick with the scent of sweat and determination. Lay's brother Nate, a weary man with a quiet intensity, stood beside her at every gathering, his jaw set and his eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of danger. Her fiancé Liam, broad-shouldered and steady, gripped her hand tightly, his calloused fingers a silent promise of protection. Together, they became the heartbeat of the movement, their shared pain fueling a collective cry for change. Lay's mind often drifted to the moment Harper's gun had fred the sharp crack, the searing pain, the way her unborn child had seemed to kick in protest within her womb. She could still see Harper's cold smirk, the arrogance in his pale blue eyes as he'd pulled the trigger, believing his badge gave him the right to play God. That memory stoked her resolve, a burning coal she carried in her chest. She wouldn't let him win. Not now, not ever. The day of reckoning finally arrived, dawning crisp and clear, the sky a brilliant blue that felt almost mocking in its serenity. The district attorney's voice cut through the morning stillness. As he stood before a sea of microphones, his tone grave yet resolute, "Officer Harper will face trial for his actions," he announced. His words met with a roar of approval from the gathered crowd. Lee stood among them, her swollen belly a testament to the life she fought to protect, her heart pounding with a mix of dread and anticipation. The community held its breath as one, their collective gaze fixed on the courthouse looming in the distancia gray, imposing structure that seemed to embody both promise and peril. Inside those walls, justice would either be served or denied, and the weight of that uncertainty pressed down on Lay's shoulders like a physical force. The courtroom was a cauldron of tension when the trial began, its high ceilings and polished wooden benches amplifying every sound shuffle of feet, the rustle of papers, the sharp intake of breath as the jury filed in. Lee sat between Nate and Liam, her hands trembling in her lap as she tried to steady her racing pulse. Nate's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the bench, his quiet fury simmering beneath a mask of calm. Liam's arm rested protectively around her shoulders, his warmth a lifeline in the storm of her emotions. Across the room, Harper slouched in his chair, his uniform crisp, but his demeanor careless. As if this were just another inconvenience he'd shrug off. His lawyer, a slick man with a perpetual frown, scribbled notes beside him. But Harper's eyes roamed the room with a lazy disdain that made Lay's stomach churn. The judge, a stern woman with silver-streaked hair and a gaze that could cut glass, presided over the proceedings with an air of unshakable authority. Her presence alone seemed to shift the atmosphere, a silent warning that no one, not even a decorated officer, stood above the law. The trial unfolded like a slow, agonizing dance, each testimony peeling back another layer of Harper's brutality. Witnesses recounted the day of the shooting in vivid detail, the way Harper had barked orders at Lee during a routine stop, his voice dripping with venom when she dared to question him, the flash of his gun as he fired without hesitation, uncaring of the life growing inside her. Lay's own testimony was the hardest, her voice quaking as she relived the terror, her hands cradling her belly as if to shield her unborn child from the memory. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she held her head high, her words a defiant arrow aimed at Harper's heart. The crowd outside the courthouse grew louder with each passing day, their chants seeping through the walls, a constant reminder of the stakes at play. When the verdict finally came, time seemed to slow. The foreman's voice rang out, steady and clear, guilty of excessive use of force. A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by an eruption of cheers that shook the very foundation of the building. Lay's tears flowed freely now, a flood of relief and vindication as she turned to embrace Nate and Liam. "We did it," she cried, her voice raw with emotion. "This is for all of us." Outside, the celebration spilled into the streets, a chaotic symphony of laughter, shouts, and the clinking of raised bottles. Lee stood atop a makeshift stage, her silhouette framed against the setting sun, her voice rising above the din. "This isn't the end," she declared, her words carrying the weight of a vow. "It's just the beginning." The crowd roared in agreement, their faces alight with a shared triumph that felt hard-won and fragile all at once. Taylor, a young artist who documented the movement with her sketches, watched from the sidelines, her pencil still as she absorbed the scene. She'd seen the spark ignite in Lay's eyes months ago, and now she realized their story was a beacon known that would light the way for others. Harper's conviction wasn't just a personal victory. It was a crack in the armor of a system that had long abused its power, a lesson etched in the sweat and tears of a community that refused to bow. In the days that followed, Lay's voice grew stronger, her resolve tempered by the fire of her experience. She became a beacon of advocacy, her story rippling outward to inspire others who'd faced the same shadows of discrimination and violence. Standing before packed rooms, she spoke of the pain, the fear, but also the hope, the unshakable belief that change was possible when people stood together. Nate and Liam remained her pillars, their quiet strength a constant reminder of the family she fought for. Even Taylor stepped into the spotlight, her artwork amplifying their message, her once timid hands now bold with purpose. The road ahead stretched long and treacherous, lined with obstacles Harper's trial had only begun to dismantle. But Lee faced it with a fierce determination, her voice a clarion call that would not be silenced. This wasn't just her journey, it was a testament to resilience, a vivid illustration of how a community's unity could topple even the mightiest of oppressors. The lesson lingered in the air like the echo of the crowd's cheers. Justice wasn't a gift bestowed from on high, it was a right seized through struggle, a flame kept alive by those brave enough to confront the dark. Harper's fall was a stark reminder that power, when wielded without accountability, was a hollow shell destined to crumble. Lay's fight, and the fight of those around her, proved that every voice mattered, every step forward a victory against the weight of oppression. Together, they'd forged a path toward a world where fairness wasn't a dream, but a reality one they'd build, brick by brick, with their own hands. The air in the courtroom hung thick with tension, a palpable weight pressing down on everyone inside its austere walls. The wooden benches creaked faintly as spectators shifted, their hushed whispers threading through the silence like a low hum. Officer Trent Hayes sat at the defense table, his broad shoulders slouched just enough to betray the unease gnawing at him. He'd walked into this trial with the swagger of a man who'd bent the rules before and gotten away with it, but now, under the piercing scrutiny of Judge Carter, that confidence was fraying at the edges. His fingers twitched against the polished tabletop, betraying a restlessness he couldn't quite suppress. When the prosecutor's voice sliced through the stillness, sharp and deliberate, asking him to explain the words he'd let slip in a recorded video like a knife, Hayes faltered. His head jerked up, eyes darting toward the judge's bench, then to the jury, then back again, as if searching for an escape hatch that didn't exist. His lawyer, Mr. Palmer, sprang to his feet with the urgency of a man trying to plug a leaking dam. "Your Honor," he interjected, his voice smooth but tinged with a nervous edge. "The defense will clarify this matter during cross-examination." I respectfully request. His words were cut off midstream by Judge Carter's icy retort. "I wasn't speaking to you, Mr. Palmer," she said, her tone as unyielding as granite. Her dark eyes bore into Hayes, pinning him where he sat. "I want to hear it from Officer Hayes himself." The room seemed to contract around him, the walls inching closer as every gaze turned his way. For the first time, Hayes's mask of bravado slipped. His lips parted, then closed, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his weathered face. He stammered, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't recall the exact context of that moment, Your Honor." His voice was smaller than he'd intended, lacking the gruff authority he usually wielded like a club. Judge Carter leaned forward slightly, her expression sharpening. "Interesting," she said, the word dripping with quiet menace. "You'll have ample time to jog your memory as this trial unfolds." She eased back into her high-backed chair, her gaze never wavering from Hayes. The courtroom buzzed with subdued murmurers exchanging sidelong glances, spectators leaning forward as if drawn into the unfolding drama. It was clear to everyone present that this was no routine proceeding. Hayes had stepped into a crucible, and Judge Carter's steely resolve promised to test him in ways he hadn't anticipated. The lesson was already taking shape. Power, when wielded carelessly, invited consequences that could cut deeper than any blade. As the murmurs settled, the prosecutor, Ortiz, strode forward with measured steps, a man whose every movement radiated purpose. He carried a thick file in his hands, but his real weapon was the massive spreadsheet now projected onto a screen, for all to see, a stark grid of numbers that laid Hayes's career bare. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Ortiz began, his voice steady but resonant, pacing slowly before the 12 men and women tasked with delivering justice. "This is the record of Officer Hayes's traffic stops over the past 3 years. Out of 237 stops, 180 for involved black or brown drivers. That's over 77%. He paused, letting the statistics settle like dust after a storm. "Now, consider this city's demographics. Less than 35% of our population falls into those groups." The jurors' faces shifted, some furrowed their brows, others pursed their lips. A few scribbled notes. Ortiz pressed on, his tone growing firmer. "But it doesn't stop there. Of those 180 for stops, 128 led to arrests. And of those arrests, 11,086% were either dismissed outright or ended in no conviction. Baseless charges, no evidence. In fact, 47 of those cases were thrown out by this very courthouse." He turned to face the jury directly, his dark eyes locking onto theirs. "This isn't a fluke. It's a pattern of bias that screams louder than any excuse Officer Hayes might offer." Hayes squirmed in his seat, his face reddening as the numbers painted a portrait he couldn't dodge. He leaned toward his lawyer, his voice a low hiss. "This is a damn circus. That data doesn't prove a thing." But his bravado rang hollow, drowned out by Judge Carter's voice cutting through the room like a whip crack. "Officer Hayes," she said, her words precise and cold, "if you have something to say, speak up so the entire courtroom can hear you." Hayes froze, his jaw tightening as every eye turned to him again. For a moment, irritation flared in his chest. He wasn't used to being called out. Not like this, but it quickly gave way to a prickling discomfort. "No, Your Honor," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "Nothing to say." Judge Carter's eyes glinted with something dangerous. "Good," she replied, her tone as smooth as ice. "Let's keep it that way unless you're under oath." The exchange was a stark reminder. In this room, Unchecked power bowed to justice, and Hayes was learning that lesson the hard way. Ortiz didn't miss a beat, calling his next witness with the calm assurance of a man who knew the tide was turning. Marcus Daniels stepped forward, a young teacher whose quiet dignity stood in stark contrast to the chaos Hayes had wrought. His suit was crisp, the creases sharp against his frame, and his posture was ramrod straight as he approached the stand. But beneath that composed exterior, a storm of emotions churned. He'd spent years molding young minds, teaching them to trust in fairness, in systems that were supposed to protect them. Now, as he raised his right hand and swore to tell the truth, the weight of his disillusionment pressed against his ribs. "I was driving home after a long day," he began, his voice steady but threaded with a quiet ache. "It was late, and I was tired grading papers, planning lessons. I saw the lights flashing in my rearview mirror and pulled over right away. I didn't think twice about it." He paused, his gaze drifting to the floor for a moment before lifting to meet the jury's. "When Officer Hayes came to my window, I greeted him politely. 'Good evening, sir. May I ask why I was stopped?' He didn't answer. He just stared at me, his face hard, and told me to get out of the car. I asked why I just wanted to understand, but he got loud, aggressive. 'Step out now,' he barked." Marcus's hands clenched briefly at his sides as he relived the moment. "I did what he said. I stepped out, kept my hands up. I've seen the videos, heard the stories. I didn't want any trouble. But before I could say another word, he grabbed me, spun me around, and slammed me against the hood. The metal was cold against my cheek, and then the cuffs clicked tight around my wrists. I asked again, 'Why am I being arrested?' And that's when he said it." His voice faltered, a crack breaking through his calm. He said, "You people need to learn some respect." The courtroom fell silent, the air heavy with the raw truth of his words. Ortiz let the moment stretch, giving the jury time to feel the sting of it. "And how did that make you feel, Mr. Daniels?" he asked gently. Marcus drew a deep breath, his chest rising and falling as he fought to keep his composure. "Humiliated," he said, the word trembling on his lips, "dehumanized. I've spent my life telling kids they can trust the system, that it's there to protect them. But that night, pinned against my own car, I realized something awful to some people. I'm not a teacher, not a person, just a color. And that's all they'll ever see." His eyes glistened, but he held his head high as he stepped down, the weight of his testimony lingering like a shadow. Hayes couldn't stay quiet. He leaned toward his lawyer again, his voice a harsh whisper. "He's exaggerating. It didn't happen like that." But the words sounded desperate, even to his own ears. Judge Carter's eyebrow arched, her patience wearing thin. "Is there something you'd like to clarify, Officer Hayes?" she asked, her tone laced with quiet warning. Hayes swallowed hard, his usual cockiness crumbling under her stare. "No, Your Honor," he said, his voice tight. The faintest smirk tugged at the judge's lips. "Very well," she replied. "Let's proceed." The trial was slipping out of Hayes's grasp, and he could feel it a slow unraveling he couldn't stop. Justice wasn't just a word here. It was a force, and it was closing in. The prosecutor called Dr. Simone Grayson next, a criminal justice expert whose presence filled the room with quiet authority. She was a woman who'd spent decades dissecting the tangled web of bias in law enforcement. Her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a tight bun, her tailored blazer exuding professionalism. As she settled into the witness stand, her hands folded neatly before her, she radiated a calm certainty that demanded attention. "Dr. Grayson," Ortiz began, "you've reviewed Officer Hayes' record and the data we provided. What do your findings reveal?" She nodded, her voice clear and measured. "Officer Hayes' traffic stops and arrests show an unmistakable pattern of racial profiling. Statistically, his behavior deviates sharply from the norm. His stop and arrest rate for black drivers is nearly 3 times higher than that of his white counterparts on the force, even when you account for variables like time of day or neighborhood." Ortiz stepped closer to the jury, ensuring her words hit home. "And what does this pattern suggest to you?" he asked. "It suggests a persistent bias," Dr. Grayson replied, her tone unwavering. "Whether he's aware of it or not, Officer Hayes targets individuals based on race with alarming consistency. This isn't a one-off mistake, it's a systemic issue embedded in his conduct. At the defense table, Hayes scoffed, shaking his head as if he could dismiss her words with a gesture. His lawyer's hand shot to his arm, a whispered reprimand barely audible, but the damage was done. Judge Carter leaned forward, her voice slicing through the air. "Officer Hayes, if you cannot maintain decorum, I will have you removed from this courtroom. Do I make myself clear?" Hayes's face burned, but he nodded. "Yes, Your Honor," he muttered, his defiance wilting. Ortiz pressed on. "Dr. Grayson, what are the broader consequences of this behavior in law enforcement?" Her expression grew solemn. "The fallout is profound," she said. "It shatters trust in the police, especially in communities of color. It breeds fear and resentment, making it nearly impossible for good officers to do their jobs effectively. And for people like Mr. Daniels, it inflicts trauma necessary, unjust pain for no crime at all, just for existing." Her words hung in the air, a damning indictment not just of Hayes, but of a system that had let his actions fester unchecked. The defense attorney tried to counter, his voice tinged with frustration. "Dr. Grayson, couldn't these discrepancies be coincidental? Maybe Officer Hayes was just assigned to high-crime areas with more minority residents." She smiled faintly, unruffled. "Possible, but improbable. The data spans years, across multiple beats. Other officers in those same areas don't show these disparities. Officer Hayes is an outlier and not in a way that reflects well on him." As Dr. Grayson stepped down, the jury's faces told the story. They were listening, absorbing, weighing. Judge Carter glanced at the clock, her gavel poised. "We'll take a 15-minute recess," she announced, the sharp crack of wood against wood echoing through the room. People filed out, their footsteps a muted shuffle, but Hayes stayed rooted to his seat. His jaw was clenched so tight it ached, his fists balled against the table. "This is ridiculous," he hissed to his lawyer. "They're all against me," Mr. Palmer sighed, rubbing his temples as if nursing a headache. "Trent, you're not helping yourself. Keep your head down and let me handle this." Across the room, Judge Carter lingered at the bench, her pen scratching notes against a legal pad. Her face was a mask of calm, but her eyes burned with a fierce determination. She'd seen men like Hayes before, arrogant, untouchable, drunk on their own authority, and she knew the cost of letting that power run wild. Justice wasn't just her job, it was her vow. And as the trial stretched on, it was clear she'd hold Hayes to account, no matter how deep his reckoning cut. The courtroom buzzed with a restless hum as it reconvened, the air thick with anticipation and the weight of what was to come. Officer Anthony Rivera stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking softly against the hardwood floor as he made his way to the witness stand. A man of quiet dignity, Rivera carried himself with the steady resolve of someone who'd spent years earning the respect of his peers at Hayes Precinct. His dark eyes flickered with a mix of duty and unease, knowing full well the gravity of what he was about to sign, the man it would implicate. For Rivera, this wasn't just testimony, it was a reckoning, a moment where the unspoken truths of the precinct would spill into the open, no matter the cost. Ortiz, the prosecutor, rose from his seat with a calm intensity, his sharp suit a stark contrast to the tension radiating from the defense table. "Officer Rivera," he began, his voice warm yet commanding, "thank you for taking the stand today. You've worked alongside Officer Hayes for several years, haven't you?" Rivera nodded, his posture rigid but his tone even. "Yes, sir, over 5 years. Same shifts, same precinct." His words were simple, but beneath them lay a current of reluctance, as if he could feel Hayes' piercing glare boring into him from across the room. Ortiz stepped closer, his gaze encouraging yet unrelenting. "And in all that time, have you ever noticed anything troubling about how Officer Hayes carries out his duties?" The question hung in the air like a thunderclap, and before Rivera could respond, Hayes' lawyer shot to his feet, his voice sharp with indignation, objection, leading the witness. Judge Carter, perched at the bench with an air of unshakable authority, didn't flinch. "Overruled," she said, her tone crisp as the strike of a gavel. "Proceed, Mr. Ortiz." Her dark eyes flicked briefly to Rivera, a silent signal to speak freely. Rivera hesitated, his breath catching as he glanced toward Hayes. The man sat hunched at the defense table, his face a mask of barely contained rage, his knuckles whitening as they gripped the edge of the wood. For a fleeting second, their eyes met a stare, a storm of fury and warning. River is a quiet battleground of doubt and resolve. Then Rivera straightened, drawing a deep breath as if to steady himself against the weight of his next words. "Yes," he said, his voice low but firm. "I've seen things that worry me. Hayes has a habit or reputation, really, for singling out minority drivers. I've heard him say things that don't sit right." Ortiz tilted his head, his expression urging Rivera to go on. "What kind of things? Can you be specific?" Rivera shifted in his seat, the wooden chair creaking under him as he wrestled with the discomfort of betrayal, not just of Hayes, but of the unspoken code that had long governed their precinct. "Comments," he said finally, his voice growing steadier with each word. He'd say how those people don't belong in certain parts of town, how they're always stirring up trouble. He'd call traffic stops a chance to teach them a lesson. Stuff like that. A ripple of shock coursed through the courtroom, a collective gasp that seemed to suck the air from the space. Hayes' face flushed a deep, angry crimson, and with a sudden, furious motion, he slammed his fist down on the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "This is bullshit," he snarled, his voice raw with defiance. Judge Carter's head snapped toward him, her eyes narrowing into icy slits. "Officer Hayes," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "One more outburst, and I will hold you in contempt. Do I make myself clear?" Her words dripped with authority, each syllable a reminder of the power she wielded and the justice she intended to uphold. Hayes' jaw tightened, his hands trembling with suppressed rage, but he forced a curt nod. "Yes, Your Honor," he muttered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Satisfied, Judge Carter turned back to Rivera, her stern expression softening just enough to offer him a lifeline. "Please continue, Officer Rivera," she said, her tone a quiet encouragement amidst the storm. Rivera nodded, his resolve hardening. "There's this unwritten rule at the precinct. You don't cross Hayes. He's been there longer than most of us, knows people in high places. He's untouchably, or at least, he thinks he is. But what he did to Marcus Daniels," his voice faltered, a flicker of anguish crossing his face as he recalled the incident that had brought them all here. "It wasn't just excessive, it was wrong, plain and simple." Ortiz gave a slow, appreciative nod, his voice steady as he concluded. "Thank you, Officer Rivera, for your candor. No further questions." He returned to his seat, leaving the room buzzing with the weight of Rivera's testimony. The defense attorney rose, his movements jerky, his forced smile a thin veneer over his rattled nerves. "Officer Rivera," he began, his tone overly casual. "Precincts like yours deal with high crime areas, don't they? Couldn't Officer Hayes' actions just be part of keeping the peace?" Rivera's brow furrowed, a spark of indignation flaring in his eyes. "High crime doesn't justify bias," he shot back, his voice firm. "Plenty of us work those same streets without picking people out because of their race." The defense attorney pressed on, desperation creeping into his words. "But isn't it possible your view of Hayes is colored by your own perspective?" Rivera didn't waver. "My view comes from what I've seen and heard. The facts don't lie." Defeated, the defense attorney slunk back to his seat, his argument crumbling under the weight of Rivera's unflinching honesty. Hayes, meanwhile, looked like a volcano on the verge of eruption, his lawyer whispering urgently in his ear. But Hayes shook him off, his anger a live wire sparking beneath his skin. Judge Carter's voice cut through the tension once more. "We'll move to closing arguments tomorrow. Court is adjourned." The gavel fell with a resounding crack, and the room began to empty. Hayes stormed out, his footsteps heavy with fury, his face twisted into a snarl. Outside, he rounded on his lawyer, his voice a low growl. "This is a damn setup. They're all out to get me." His lawyer sighed, exhaustion etching lines into his face. "Trent, I told you this wouldn't be easy. You've backed yourself into a corner." Nearby, Marcus Daniels lingered by the courtroom doors. His family gathered close. His soft-spoken words to Ortiz were laced with cautious hope, a man clinging to the belief that justice might finally tip in his favor. Judge Carter swept past, her robe billowing like a dark tide, and for a brief moment, she paused. Her eyes met Marcus, and the stern mask she wore softened into a faint, reassuring smile, a silent promise that the next day would bring clarity. Morning broke over a courtroom packed to the brim, the air electric with expectation. Hayes entered, his usual swagger replaced by a cold, brittle tension, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Marcus. Sitting quietly beside his attorney, Marcus met Hayes' glare with a steady calm, his hands folded in his lap, refusing to be intimidated. Judge Carter took her place at the bench, her presence a gravitational force that silenced the room. "Let us proceed with closing arguments," she declared. "Mr. Ortiz, you may begin." Ortiz stood, his movements deliberate as he buttoned his jacket and approached the jury. His voice was measured, but a fierce passion simmered beneath it. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've seen the evidence, hours of testimony, hard data, video footage, and the words of Officer Hayes' own colleague. This isn't a one-off mistake or a simple misunderstanding. It's a pattern, a thread of prejudice and power misused, woven through years of behavior. Look at Marcus Daniels." He gestured toward the man, his tone softening with reverence. "A teacher, a guide, a pillar in his community. That night, he followed every rule, asked a fair question, and what did he get? Violence, disrespect. Why? Because of the color of his skin." His voice rose, filling the room with its urgency. "This trial is about holding power to account. It's about telling every person who's been unfairly targeted that their voice matters. If we let this slide, what do we say to the next Marcus Daniels? What do we say to our communities? Justice isn't just a word, it's a stand we take today." He stepped back, his words lingering like a challenge as he returned to his seat. The defense attorney stood, his face grave as he faced the jury. "My client, Officer Hayes, has given years to this city. Law enforcement isn't a cushy desk job, it's split-second calls in the heat of chaos. What happened that night was unfortunate, yes, but it wasn't deliberate bias or a rights violation. The prosecution paints him as a monster, but reality isn't that simple. Mistakes happen. We can't crucify everyone who risks their life to keep us safe." He sat, casting a tense glance at Hayes, who offered a stiff nod. Judge Carter leaned forward, her gaze sweeping the room before settling on Hayes. He shifted uneasily, his bravado fraying at the edges. "This case," she began, her voice resonant with purpose, "is bigger than one traffic stop. It's about justice and equality principles we're sworn to protect. Officer Hayes, your actions, captured on video and laid bare by witnesses, were not just unprofessional, they were a betrayal of the trust placed in you. You were given power to serve, not to oppress. And power abused carries a price." Hayes' face darkened, his lips parting as if to protest. But a sharp whisper from his lawyer silenced him. Judge Carter turned to the jury. "Your decision will shape what justice means here. Be thorough, be fair." The gavel struck, and as the jury filed out, Hayes bolted to his feet, his voice a venomous hiss. "This is a witch hunt." Judge Carter paused, her eyes locking onto him with a chilling calm. "Officer Hayes, watch yourself. Accountability isn't a privilege you can dodge anymore." She swept from the room, leaving him seething. Outside, Marcus waited with his attorney, the air heavy with tension but threaded with hope. Hours later, the jury returned, and the verdict hung like a storm about to break. Hayes sat, arms crossed, his scowl a mask for the unease gnawing at him. Marcus gripped his hands tighter, his family a silent pillar behind him. In that moment, the courtroom held its breath, teetering on the edge of justicing the undeniable truth. That power unchecked would always meet its reckoning. From time to time, Marcus Daniels cast fleeting, anxious glances toward the heavy wooden doors of the jury room, his heart thudding in his chest like a drumbeat he couldn't silence. He wondered really whether the 12 men and women behind those doors truly grasped the enormity of the choice they held in their hands. His faith in the process hadn't wavered, not entirely, but the waiting gnawed at him, each ticking second stretching into a lifetime. His palms were damp, his breath shallow, though he fought to keep his posture steady. His chin lifted. He'd endured too much to crumble now. At last, after what seemed an endless stretch of torment hours, bleeding into one another like a slow drip of water wearing down, stone doors creaked open. The jury emerged, their faces a mix of exhaustion and resolve, filing into their seats with a quiet shuffle that seemed to suck the air from the room. Every whisper, every rustle of clothing fell silent as Judge Evelyn Carter swept in moments later, her black robe trailing behind her like a shadow of authority. She carried herself with the kind of presence that didn't just demand respect, it seized it, unyielding and absolute. Settling into her high-backed chair, she cast a quick, piercing glance at the jury foreman before her voice cut through the stillness. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" The foreman, a woman in her late 40s named Clara Henshaw, rose to her feet. She was an unassuming figure, graying hair pulled into a neat bun. Glasses perched low on her nose, but there was a steadiness in her stance, a quiet strength that belied her soft appearance. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a single sheet of paper, the ink on it carrying the weight of months of testimony, evidence, and raw emotion. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied, her voice clear despite the faint quiver beneath it. "We have." The courtroom seemed to hold its breath collectively, a shared tension binding every soul in that space, plaintiff, defendant, spectators alike. The bailiff, a broad-shouldered man with a weathered face, stepped forward to take the verdict from Clara's hands, his boots thudding softly against the polished floor. He handed it to Judge Carter, who unfolded it with deliberate care. Her expression remained a mask of stone as her eyes scanned the words, betraying nothing but a flicker of surprise, not a hint of satisfaction. She passed it back to Clara with a nod. "Please read the verdict aloud." Clara adjusted her glasses, cleared her throat, and let her voice fill the room. "In the matter of Marcus Daniels versus Officer Trent Hayes, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty of civil rights violations." The words landed like a thunderclap, reverberating through the wooden benches and up into the high ceiling. A ripple of murmurs broke out, soft at first, then swelling as the reality sank in. Marcus exhaled sharply, a rush of air he hadn't realized he'd been holding since the trial began. His shoulders, taut with months of strain, eased just a fraction, and a faint warmth crept into his chest relief, tentative but real. Beside him, his attorney, a weary man with sharp eyes and a steady hand, gave him a small, encouraging nod, the barest hint of a smile tugging at his lips. In the rows behind, Marcus's familiar mother with her tear-streaked face, his younger sister clutching her hands so tight her knuckles whitened, leaned into one another, their embraces silent but brimming with emotion, too deep for words. Across the room, Officer Trent Hayes reacted as if the verdict had struck him physically. His face flushed a deep, furious crimson, the color rising from his neck like a tide of rage. He shot to his feet, his chair screeching against the floor with a harsh, grating sound that sliced through the murmurs. "This is a damn joke," he bellowed, his voice raw and jagged, trembling with disbelief. "I've done nothing wrong, nothing." Judge Carter's gavel came down with a crack, sharp and commanding, cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Officer Hayes, sit down," she ordered, her tone icy and unyielding. "This is your final warning." But Hayes was beyond reason, his composure unraveling like a thread pulled too tight. "This whole trial's been rigged from the start. A biased judge, a biased jury, a complete sham." The courtroom erupted into a chorus of gasps and hushed exclamations, spectators craning their necks to watch the spectacle unfold. Hayes's attorney, a balding man in a rumpled suit named Richard Grayson, lunged forward, grabbing his client's arm in a desperate bid to rein him in. "Trent, stop," he hissed, his voice low and urgent. But Hayes wrenched himself free, his fury boiling over, his once polished image as a steadfast officer disintegrating before everyone's eyes. Judge Carter rose from her seat, her frame towering above the bench, her expression as frigid as a winter storm. "Bailiff," she said, her voice steady but laced with steel, "remove Officer Hayes from this courtroom immediately. I will not tolerate this behavior." The bailiff moved swiftly, his heavy steps echoing as he approached. Hayes resisted at first, his broad shoulders squaring as if ready to fight. But the bailiff's firm grip and the weight of the moment forced him to relent. Muttering curses under his breath, his voice a low growl of defiance, he was escorted out, his polished boots dragging slightly against the floor. The room watched in stunned silence as the man who had once strode through life with unshakable arrogance was reduced to a figure of humiliation. his pride stripped bare for all to see. Judge Carter turned her gaze back to the jury, her demeanor softening just enough to convey gratitude. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your service in this matter. Justice has been served today because of your unwavering dedication to fairness and truth." Then, addressing the courtroom at large, her voice grew resolute, each word deliberate and heavy with meaning. "Let this case stand as a stark reminder. No one stands above the law. Authority is not a shield to hide behind when accountability calls. It is a mantle of responsibility. And when that responsibility is abused, the consequences will be met with the full, unyielding force of justice." Her words settled over the room like a thick fog, lingering in the air, pressing against every heart and mind present. For Marcus, they brought a sting of tears to his eyes, not from sorrow, but from a profound, almost disorienting relief. For the first time since that fateful night, when the weight of Hayes' abuse of power had crashed into his life, he felt seen. He felt vindicated. As the courtroom began to empty, Judge Carter remained at the bench, her sharp eyes tracking Hayes' retreating form, now flanked by officers and bound in handcuffs. To her, this wasn't just a trial's conclusion, it was a declaration, a line drawn in the sand. The room gradually cleared, spectators filtering out into the halls, their footsteps echoing faintly, but the gravity of what had unfolded hung in the air, an unshakable presence that refused to dissipate. Marcus stood with his family, his attorney still at his side, a quiet pillar of support. His mother reached for his hand, her fingers trembling but warm, and his sister wrapped an arm around his waist, her face buried against his shoulder. For the first time in months, a fragile spark of hope flickered within him, a belief that justice, though it had taken its time, wasn't entirely beyond his reach. Meanwhile, in a narrow side hallway, Trent Hayes paced a cramped holding area, his fury a live wire crackling beneath his skin. The space was stark gray walls, a single flickering bulb overhead, a metal bench bolted to the floor. He moved like a predator trapped in a cage, his breath short and ragged, his muttered grievances spilling out in a venomous stream. "Unfair, rigged. That judge had it out for me." Across from him, Richard Grayson sat slumped on the bench, his elbows on his knees, his hands rubbing at his temples as if he could massage away the headache this day had become. "Trent," he said at last, his voice weary but firm, "you need to calm down. The more you lash out, the worse this gets. Sentencing's still ahead, and any shot at leniency hinges on how you act now." "Leniency?" Hayes spat, whirling to face his lawyer, his eyes wild with contempt. "That woman doesn't want leniency, she wants my head on a platter." This whole thing was a setup from the jump, Grayson sighed, a long, resigned sound, recognizing the futility of reasoning with a man too consumed by his own narrative. "I warned you, Trent," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Your actions have consequences." Back in the courtroom, Judge Carter lingered at the bench, her hands sifting through a stack of documents, evidence logs, sentencing guidelines. Her face was impassive, but her eyes held a glint of something deeper, perhaps the burden of her role, or the quiet resolve of a woman who'd spent decades upholding the law against men who thought themselves untouchable. She'd seen Hayes' type before, brash, entitled, convinced the badge was a free pass. But she also knew that even men like him could be taught sometimes the hard way that power unchecked was a debt the law would always collect. When the courtroom reconvened that afternoon, the air buzzed with anticipation. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. Community members packed the benches shoulder to shoulder, their faces a mix of curiosity and righteous anger. Hayes was brought back in, his earlier outburst replaced by a simmering resentment that radiated from his stiff posture. He sat at the defense table, his jaw tight, his lawyer murmuring last-minute counsel in his ear. Judge Carter took her place, her presence as formidable as ever, and addressed the room. "Before I deliver the sentence, I will allow the defendant to speak if he wishes. Officer Hayes, do you have anything to say?" Hayes hesitated, his eyes flicking to Grayson, who gave him a curt nod. Rising slowly, he straightened his shoulders, though his hands clenched at his sides betrayed his tension. "Yes, Your Honor," he began, his voice low but threaded with defiance. "I've served this city for over 15 years. I've put my life on the line every day for these people. Sure, Mistakes might have happened. But this trial, it's been a circus unfair from the start. I've been painted as some kind of monster for doing my job, and I stand by my record. I'm no racist, and I don't deserve to be treated like one. The people who know me, they get it, they know who I really am. He sat abruptly, crossing his arms, his face a mask of stubborn pride. Grayson winced, the absence of remorse in Hayes' words hanging like a dark cloud. Judge Carter drew a slow breath, her gaze sharpening as she leaned forward slightly. "Officer Hayes," she began, her voice calm but edged with an authority that silenced the room. "Your statement reveals more than you might realize in it about your service, but about your character. At no point have you acknowledged the harm you inflicted on Mr. Daniels or the community. You swore to protect. Instead, you've clung to arrogance, deflecting blame at every turn." Her eyes bore into him, unrelenting. "You call yourself a guardian of this city, yet your actions have fractured the trust people place in those who wear the badge. Your service doesn't absolve your misconduct, it amplifies its severity." The silence that followed was suffocating, her words sinking into the room like stones into still water. "Justice isn't vengeance, Officer Hayes," she continued, her tone unwavering. "It's accountability, and today, this court will ensure that accountability is upheld." Hayes shifted in his seat, his bravado faltering, a flicker of unease breaking through his defiance. Every eye was on Judge Carter as she straightened, her gaze locking onto him with the weight of inevitability. "Officer Trent Hayes," she declared, her voice resounding through the chamber. "This court must weigh justice against the potential for rehabilitation. As an officer, you were entrusted with immense power, and with that power came a duty to treat every individual with fairness and respect, regardless of who they are. You betrayed that trust." She paused, letting the gravity of her words settle. "This court sentences you to 18 months in federal prison for violating the civil rights of Marcus Daniels. During your incarceration, you will complete a mandatory bias training program. Upon release, you will serve 300 hours of community service, working directly with the communities your actions have wounded. Your certification as a law enforcement officer is revoked, effective immediately." Gasps swept through the room, the phrases "federal prison" and "revoked certification" striking like blows. Hayes' face drained of color, his jaw clenching so hard it seemed his teeth might crack. Grayson slumped beside him, the defeat palpable. But Judge Carter pressed on. "Furthermore, this court orders you to issue a public apology, a formal, written statement to Mr. Daniels and the community, delivered in an open forum where those you've harmed can bear witness to your accountability." Hayes shot to his feet, his voice a strangled shout. "This is outrageous," but the bailiff was already moving, his hand firm on Hayes' shoulder, guiding him back down. Marcus sat motionless, his chest tight with a flood of emotions. Vindication, yes, but also the weight of what this victory had cost him. His mother squeezed his hand, tears streaming down her face, while his sister whispered, "It's over, Marcus, it's finally over." The courtroom buzzed as people began to file out. But the lesson lingered. Power, when wielded without care, invited consequences that no badge could deflect. For Marcus, it was a step toward healing. For Hayes, it was a mirror held up to a man who'd refused to see himself until the law forced him to look. In the packed courtroom, the air grew thick with tension as Officer Trent Hayes felt the heat of his anger surging once again, a molten tide threatening to burst free. His voice trembled with indignation as he stammered, "You can't do this. This is nothing but a damned witch hunt. I've given everything to this community." His words, sharp and desperate, hung in the air for only a moment before Judge Abigail Carter's voice sliced through them like a honed blade. "Sit down," she commanded, her tone carrying the unyielding weight of authority. Hayes froze mid-sentence, his mouth gaping as if the words had been yanked from his throat. Slowly, reluctantly, he sank back into the hard wooden chair, his chest heaving. His lawyer, a weary man with a pinched face, leaned in close, gripping Hayes' arm with urgency and whispering something fierce and low. But Hayes barely registered this fury churned just beneath his skin, a storm he could scarcely contain. Judge Carter, perched high on her bench, fixed him with a gaze as cold and unyielding as steel. Her words came deliberate and cutting, each one landing like a hammer on stone. "Throughout this trial, You've pointed fingers at everyone but yourself. Even now, with a mountain of evidence stacked against you and a process that's been nothing if not fair, you refuse to own what you've done. Let me make this crystal clear. This sentence isn't just about punishing you. It's about showing this community every soul and if that no one, not even those cloaked in power, stands above the law. Her eyes, sharp and discerning, swept across the room, settling on Marcus Daniels, who sat quietly among his family. To Mr. Daniels and those who stand with him, she continued, her voice softening just enough to carry a trace of warmth. I hope today brings you some semblance of justice. Your bravery in stepping forward has ensured that this kind of behavior won't slip through the cracks unchecked. The system isn't flawless, but today, it worked because you refused to back down. Marcus inclined his head slightly, a gesture of quiet gratitude. Beside him, his family clung to him, his mother's hands trembling as they gripped his shoulders, his younger brother squeezing his arm as if to anchor him in the moment. The weight of it all washed over them like a slow, heavy wave, relief mingling with the exhaustion of a battle long fought. Judge Carter's attention snapped back to Hayes, her expression hardening once more. This court will not abide the abuse of authority, she declared. You're being held to account not because of the uniform you wore, but because of the choices you made. With that, she raised her gavel and brought it down with a resounding crack that reverberated through the room, a sound as final as a coffin lid slamming shut. Court is adjourned. The room erupted into a low roar of murmurs as spectators shifted in their seats, their whispers buzzing like a swarm of restless bees. Hayes sat rooted to his spot, his knuckles white as he clutched the edge of the defense table, his mind a chaotic whirl. His lawyer tugged at his sleeve, trying to pull him aside for a hurried conference. But Hayes was a statue, his eyes distant, lost in the dawning reality of what lay ahead, years behind bars. A public apology that would strip away the last shreds of his pride and the badge his shield. His identity ripped from him forever, the weight of it pressed down on him, bending his once straight shoulders into a slump. Across the room, Marcus Daniels rose to his feet, his movements slow but steady. He turned to his attorney, Samuel Ortiz, a stocky man with kind eyes and a firm handshake, and clasped his hand in thanks. Then he folded into his family's embrace. His mother's tears streaked her weathered cheeks as she pulled him close, his siblings wrapping their arms around him in a tangle of love and relief. This wasn't just Marcus's triumph. It was a beacon for anyone who'd ever felt the sting of injustice at the hands of someone like Hayes. As Judge Carter stood, her black robe flowing behind her like the wings of some avenging angel, she exited the courtroom with measured steps, leaving behind a lesson etched into the silence. Justice, flawed though it may be, had flexed its muscle today. The chamber began to empty, but the gravity of the verdict lingered, heavy and palpable. Federal marshals moved toward Hayes, their boots thudding against the polished floor. He rose stiffly, his head bowed, his once proud stride reduced to a shuffle as they led him away. The spectators' murmurs followed him, their voices edged with scorn, slicing through the last vestiges of his dignity, his career, his reputation. The carefully crafted image of a man who wielded authority with impunity of it crumbled to dust in his wake. Meanwhile, Marcus stood at the heart of his family's circle, their arms a fortress around him. Though his shoulders remained broad and strong, there was a new lightness in his bearing, a release from the burden that had gnawed at him for months. He could still hear Hayes's venomous words echoing in his mind, could still feel the humiliation of being stripped of his humanity that night. But today, justice had handed him back his dignity, piece by hard-won piece. His mother cupped his face in her hands, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Thank you, son. You didn't just fight for yourself, you fought for all of us." Marcus swallowed hard, the emotion thick in his throat. "I just wanted them to see it's not okay," he said softly, "that it can't keep happening." Nearby, reporters swarmed like moths to a flame, their cameras flashing and voices clamoring for a soundbite. Samuel Ortiz stepped in front of Marcus, raising a hand to ward them off. "Mr. Daniels has no comment right now," he said, his tone firm but calm, guiding Marcus and his family toward the courthouse doors. They stepped outside into a sea of face teachers, students, activists. Neighbors gathered on the steps, their signs thrust high, justice for all, no one above the law. Thank you, Marcus. The crowd burst into applause, a rolling wave of cheers that crashed over Marcus as he emerged. He faltered for a moment, overwhelmed by the sight of so many who'd rallied to his cause. He considered speaking, but Ortiz rested a hand on his shoulder, his smile steady. "You've done enough," he said. "Let the verdict say the rest." Marcus nodded, letting himself be guided through the throng. Hands reached out to clasp his, voices called out their gratitude, and tears flowed from those who understood the magnitude of this day, not just a single man's victory, but a community's reclaiming of its voice. Back inside the courthouse, Judge Carter sat alone in her chambers, the gavel resting silently on her desk. She stared at it, her fingers tracing its worn edges, her mind drifting. The role of judge had never been a light. Predicaments like these pressed down on her, a constant reminder of the responsibility she carried. But they also stoked the fire that had driven her to this bench, a belief that justice, however imperfect, could still carve out a path to something better. A soft knock pulled her from her thoughts. Samuel Ortiz stood in the doorway, a faint smile on his lips. "Your Honor," he said, stepping inside, "I just wanted to thank you for today. I know it wasn't easy." She gestured for him to sit, her voice steady. "Justice is never easy, Mr. Ortiz, but it's always necessary." He settled into the chair across from her, his brow furrowing slightly. "Do you think Hayes will take anything from this?" Judge Carter sighed, her piercing gaze softening for a fleeting moment. "Men like him don't change without a fight, sometimes not even then." But this wasn't just about him. It was for Marcus, his family, and every person who's felt the boot of injustice on their neck. If Hayes doesn't learn, the community will still carry the memory that no one escapes accountability. "Sometimes that's the best we can hope for." Ortiz nodded, her words settling over him like a mantle. "Well, you did something extraordinary today. Thank you." A rare, faint smile tugged at her lips. "Thank the jury, Mr. Ortiz. They tipped the Scalesi, just made sure they didn't wobble." In the days that followed, the story of Marcus Daniels and Officer Hayes rippled far beyond the city's borders. News stations seized on it, igniting fierce debates about power, policing, and the cracks in the system. Footage of Hayes being led away in handcuffs spread like wildfire online, a stark image that became a rallying cry for those long silenced. For Marcus, life began to settle back into its rhythm. He returned to his classroom, where his students wide-eyed and curious saw him not just as their teacher, but as a quiet hero. One day, a girl in the back row raised her hand. "Mr. Daniels, are you glad you stood up to him?" He paused, a thoughtful smile crossing his face. "I am," he said, "because sometimes doing what's right isn't about feeling good, it's about making sure no one else has to face what you did." For Hayes, the road ahead was a stark contrast. Prison stripped away the last threads of his authority, forcing him to sit with the wreckage of his choices. The mandatory bias training he was subjected to met fierce resistance. At first this jaw clenched, his eyes defiant. But as the months dragged on, faint fissures began to appear in his armor of arrogance. Whether they'd widen into real change was anyone's guess. But one truth was undeniable. His reign of unchecked power was finished. On the courthouse steps, where the trial had unfolded, the community later unveiled a small plaque in Marcus's honor. Beneath his name, etched in simple, bold letters, were the words, "Justice is not given, it is earned." And with that, the tale of Marcus Daniels, Judge Carter, and a trial that rattled a city became a living testament, even against the tide of prejudice. Justice could rise when people dared to demand it.